Chapter 160, Confession. When Gandalf said he would come, Dewey felt his confidence soar. In the original timeline, Gandalf had defeated the Balrog. There was no reason he couldn't do it again. And this time, he would not be alone. Smaug would fight alongside him. With the two of them together, there was no need to fear Gandalf paying with his life. Still, Dewey felt a twinge of guilt. Was he taking away Gandalf's chance to be named White? For now, the project to create a phoenix was on hold. Until they could wrest the undying flame from the Balrog, the phoenix could not be made. Meanwhile, Gandalf explained why he had come to the forest. Fangorn lay very near Isengard and Orthanc, separated from Saruman only by a southern mountain range. Since learning that Saruman had fallen and was secretly dealing with Sauron, Gandalf had been wary. He had come south to warn the Steward of Gondor and the King of Rohan, and to find a way to curb Saruman before Saruman and Sauron could combine their power. To that end, he had come to Fangorn to ask Treebeard and the Ents for help. The Ents' close sympathy with trees made them perfect sentinels around Isengard, their motionless presence unlikely to arouse Saruman's suspicion. Although Treebeard and Saruman were neighbors, their relations were cold. Treebeard trusted Gandalf instead and agreed without hesitation. The trees around Orthanc served as the Ents' eyes and ears. Even if Saruman used his Palantir, he would hardly notice those silent trunks. But the trees recorded everything, and the Ents learned of every movement near Isengard. Before long, Treebeard brought alarming news. Saruman had been secretly contacting the orcs of the Misty Mountains and recruiting the Dunlendings, and the orcs he was communicating with were the same orcs occupying Moria. Dewey and Gandalf exchanged stunned looks. They were preparing to join the dwarves to clear Moria of orcs and root out the Balrog, and now they learned Saruman was reaching into Moria too. Whether Saruman sought the Balrog's flame or merely to extend his own influence, the danger was the same. If Saruman allied with the orcs, his power would leap. Saruman was a Maya of Ale, master of smithcraft and industry. His skills in engineering, arms-making, and organization could rapidly arm and equip an army. A Saruman allied with orcs could be as dangerous as forces out of Mordor. Gandalf felt urgency. To prevent Saruman from gaining a foothold in the east, he resolved to head north toward the Lonely Mountain and organize another expedition into Moria. With dwarf assistance, they would clear out Moria's orcs and sever Saruman's reach. At the same time, Gandalf planned, with Dewey and Smaug, to root out the Balrog in Moria so it could not ally with Sauron and threaten the free peoples of Middle-earth. He left the Ents to keep watch over Isengard and set out north to Lothlorien with Dewey and Arwen. In Lothlorien, Gandalf told Galadriel and Celeborn everything. They took the reports gravely and agreed to help the dwarves retake Moria. The Elves of Lorien pledged to block the Dimril Dale exit, the eastern back door of Moria, so that the orcs' effective forces could be neutralized. Moria, once Khazad-dûm, had been the great dwarven stronghold cutting a passage through the Misty Mountains. Its main gate faced west, while the eastern exit opened into Dimril Dale, an important route between east and west. Before the dwarves delved too greedily and awakened the Balrog, Khazad-dûm had been one of the east-west passages used by many peoples, even the elves of Lothlorien. After the Balrog's ruin, the pass was closed. Travelers had to take the far more dangerous High Pass to the north or detour around the Gap of Rohan to the south, both lengthy and perilous alternatives. With Galadriel and Celeborn's support secured, Gandalf did not linger. He mounted his flying steed and set off north toward the Lonely Mountain. Dewey, however, remained in Lothlorien a few more days. Arwen took him on long walks through the Golden Wood. They walked on the soft, golden leaves of the melon trees, while she told him the age of each tree and showed him ones she had planted. They lay on the slopes of Caras Amroth, in fields of Elenor and Nifredil, and watched the sky. They followed the Nimrodel stream to its waterfall and listened to the water sing like elven maidens. They visited Eglador to trade poetry and tales with the elves. On the summit of Caras Amroth, 2 rings of trees grew, an outer ring of white trunk trees and an inner ring of golden melon trees, and in the center stood a tall tree with a white platform high among its branches that overlooked the whole wood. One evening, Dewey and Arwen sat there on the platform, feeling the gentle breeze and watching the distant sunset. The wind stirred Arwen's dark hair, and the afterglow turned her into a thing of light. The even star at her throat shone, and she seemed the very embodiment of starlight on earth. Dewey found he could not take his eyes off her. Arwen looked at him, her gaze full of gentle light. "Duir," she said softly, "have you heard the tale of my ancestor Luthien and the mortal Baron?" Dewey shook his head slightly. "Not properly. Will you tell me?" She turned her face toward the west and spoke slowly, as if she could see that ancient time. Luthien was the daughter of King Thingol and the Maya Melian, the most beautiful of the elves. Her singing could dim the stars. Her dancing was like silver moonlight. She fell in love with the mortal Baron, and together they took a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. On their return, they were set upon by the wolf Carcharoth. Baron fought the beast to protect the Silmaril. Though he slew the wolf, he was mortally wounded and died in Luthien's arms. Arwen's voice softened, full of weight. Luthien refused to accept an everlasting separation. She surrendered her elven immortality and entered the halls of Mandos, and by her singing she moved Mandos himself. The Valar took pity. They allowed Baron to return, but only if Luthien would relinquish her immortality and live out a mortal life with him. Her eyes met Dewey's. "If you were Baron Duir, would you accept Luthien giving up immortality for your sake, for a brief life together?" Dew looked into her starlit eyes and replied firmly, "No, I could never accept someone giving up eternal life for me, merely so we might have a short time together." Arwen was taken aback. The light in her eyes dimmed for a moment. "But I am greedy," she said after a breath. "I want to live with the one I love for as long as the world endures, to see the sun, moon, and stars, to witness seas dry and mountains crumble until all things pass." Dew reached out and took her hand, smiling. "Then I will not let you pay that price for me. I would feel guilty forever if you did." He held her hand a moment longer. "Arwen, will you spend every day with me, forever, until the end of the world?" Arwen's surprise turned to joy. Tears glittered in her eyes. She hesitated only a moment, then spoke, but with a worry behind it. "I long for that too, Duir, yet I can feel you are different from Gandalf. You are human. How can you live forever?" Dewey gave her a confident wink. "Have you forgotten I am a wizard? Mortals cannot escape death, but a wizard can." "Really?" Hope shone in her face. Dewey held her hand and answered quietly but confidently. "I have my ways. Besides the animagus method, the phoenix, there are other routes. I have plans for a philosopher's stone. And if everything else fails, there is always the last resort of a Horcrux, though I would never make one lightly. They are cruel and corrupting. I would only use such a thing if there were no other choice. I won't tear myself apart like that Dark Lord, and I would keep any such safeguard hidden and whole." Arwen, feeling the certainty in him, chose to trust. She blushed when she realized what was happening, but did not pull her hand away. The two watched the sunset from the platform in silence, warmth and peace between them. Back in Caras Galadhon, Galadriel and Celeborn noticed the change in the air around Dewey and Arwen. Galadriel watched Dewey with a faint, knowing smile and said nothing. Celeborn, though, frowned. He gave Dewey a look that was not friendly and turned to Arwen with concern. "Arwen," he asked, "have you truly considered this?" Arwen's expression was steady and resolute. "Grandfather, I have thought it through. Duir is my only choice." Chapter 161, Agreement. Celeborn watched his beloved granddaughter with a heavy heart. He and his wife had raised Arwen with care and tenderness, and now she stood before him determined to choose her own path. "Have you thought about more than just racial differences?" he asked at last. "There's time itself between you and him. Are you truly prepared to give up immortality and live a short life for the sake of this relationship?" Arwen shook her head, a warm smile lighting her face. The tenderness in her eyes made Celeborn's chest ache. "Grandfather, don't worry for me. Duir did not ask me to become mortal. He refused my offer to take a human fate. He wants to find a way to be by my side for as long as he can, not walk with me toward death." Across the room, Galadriel said nothing aloud. She spoke instead with her mind. Her telepathic voice was soft but penetrating as she reached out to Dewey, her smile deep and knowing. "Lady Galadriel, do you not object to my being with Arwen?" Dewey asked, surprised. Galadriel shook her head. When she described what she had seen in her mirror, Dewey felt the ground shift under him. I have used my mirror in the garden to watch past, present, and possible futures. The visions change. Every decision can open another path. Of the possible futures I saw for Arwen, one was heartbreak. She chose mortality, gained everything briefly, and in the end walked alone into the woods, buried in an unmarked place, slowly forgotten. Sadness flitted across Galadriel's face, as if she had already witnessed that lonely end. But there was another future, she added, and her expression brightened. In that future she met you. The even star becomes a morning star. Her light grows brighter than before. Why would I object to that? Dewey understood then. The gloomy destiny Galadriel had seen, Arwen choosing mortality and fading away, must have been a timeline without him. As Arwen's grandmother, in every sense, Galadriel could not bear the idea of her granddaughter giving up immortality and being taken from them by death. Dewey's presence had altered fate. The realization that Galadriel had known something of this for some time made him think back to Rivendell, when she had casually given him the Elessar, the green gem once intended as part of Aragorn's dowry, to fashion into his staff. Had she seen this outcome then? He met her gaze. Her smile held no secrets. Dewey felt awed by her foresight. Compared to Galadriel's sight, his own divination, the talent he had gained by signing into the world, felt small and crude. Celeborn could not quite accept it, though he respected Arwen's will. Elves loved deeply and loyally. Once their hearts were set, they did not change. Still, Celeborn grumbled about Dewey stealing their carefully tended cabbage. He insisted that the couple seek Elrond's blessing. So with nervous hearts, Dewey and Arwen returned to Rivendell by the fire. Elrond received them with surprise that swiftly tempered into concern when he perceived the bond between them. "Arwen, have you decided?" he asked, voice heavy. Arwen met his gaze with quiet resolve. "Yes, father. I will not change my mind." "Father," she added, smiling, "do not worry. I will not take the mortal path. Duir refused my offer. He insists on finding a way to remain with me." She told Elrond everything Dewey had proposed. Elrond listened, his face grave. "I do not wish to be obstructive," he said at last, "but immortality is not something to be treated lightly. There have been very few exceptions. My grandfather Tuor received a special grace from the Valar and was counted among the Eldar. Otherwise, men who sought immortality, Numenor among them, fell into corruption and ruin. Even great kings of men, like those who became the Nazgul, were seduced by dark power in pursuit of unlife." Dewey explained his plan. The Phoenix, an evolved animagus that might reunite the virtues of rebirth with lasting youth, and how close he was to making it real. Elrond's stern lines softened. The idea that Gandalf endorsed and might even help with the project gave him further relief. Then, Dewey produced another parchment, scripts and curious runes traced across it. Elrond peered at the diagrams and his eyes widened. "What is this?" "The method to make the Philosopher's Stone," Dewey said plainly. "A substance that can transmute base metals into gold and produce an elixir of life." Elrond, an immortal elf who had no need for such an elixir, nonetheless understood its implications. If the stone could truly grant eternal life, it would be no less wondrous than the Silmarils themselves, and no less dangerous. He reflected aloud on how the destiny of men was set by Ilúvatar. Mortality was the gift given to men, and even the Valar could not overturn it except by rare grace, as with Tuor. Dewey shook his head before Elrond could speak further. "It has a flaw," he admitted. "The stone can prolong life, perhaps indefinitely, but it cannot stop the body from aging. The longer one lives, the frailer the body becomes. Nicholas Flamel lived centuries, and his body waned. He eventually set the stone aside. Living forever without strength is no life at all." That was why Dewey was pursuing the Phoenix. If he could perfect an immortal form that did not entail decrepitude, the stone's foremost flaw would be addressed. He did not pretend he could perfect the stone alone. He had brought the parchment partly for Elrond to study, to ask for counsel and assistance. Elrond, ever the scholar, nodded in appreciation. "Even with its flaw, the Philosopher's Stone would be a tremendous achievement," he said. "The one who gives it to the world will be remembered by name, as Fëanor is remembered for the Silmarils." With the assurances of both the Phoenix Project and the Stone's plan, Elrond's opposition softened. He made 3 stipulations, firm but not punitive. The strongest condition was simple and unavoidable. Until Dewey could secure a true, lasting way to prevent Arwen's premature death, they could not assume the life of a married pair. Dewey accepted this without hesitation. Elrond did not forbid them from seeing one another. He merely required that they be patient and that Dewey share his knowledge for study. He took the rune parchment into the Hall of Fire to pore over it. Outside the halls, Dewey did not get to enjoy leisure with Arwen. Her twin brothers, Elrohir and Elladan, took it upon themselves to prepare him. They dragged him from early morning sparring to afternoon spear drills, insisting he must become strong enough to protect Arwen. They told him that at nearly 2 meters tall, he could not afford to be weak. If he ever lost his wand or staff, he would be an ordinary man and unable to protect her. So began hard days. Mornings with Elrohir, afternoons with Elladan, Dewey was constantly on the defensive. He came back to the guest rooms of Rivendell, bloodied and exhausted, and only after dabbing himself liberally with Baishan elixir would he allow himself to lie down. The brothers' attacks were fierce, but never intended to maim. Their weapons' tips never truly pierced him. Still, the training was relentless. One evening, as he struggled to reach a knot of bruises on his back, Arwen slipped in beside him and applied the salve with a gentle, practiced hand. "If you had simply surrendered to my brothers, they would have left you in peace," she chided lightly, concern in her eyes. "Why keep fighting them every day?" Dewey inhaled sharply, but held to his pride and resolve. "I can't surrender. If I did, they'd never let me see you again. Besides, how could a man ever surrender?" Since word spread that Dewey had stolen their sister's heart, the twins' vigilance had turned to constant interference. If Dewey refused their drills, they mocked him for shirking hardship for his love. So he persisted. In return, his swordsmanship and spear work improved far faster than he had expected. The Ent draught he had once drunk in the Fangorn-like woods, a strange gift that had lingered in his blood, was continuing to strengthen him. He grew stronger and more agile by degrees, and in recent sessions he could at last offer some real resistance. It was not yet enough, perhaps, but it was a beginning, and for the first time since he arrived in Rivendell, Dewey allowed himself a small, stubborn hope that he might one day stand beside Arwen without fear. Chapter 162, Expedition to Moria. Under the tutelage of Elrohir and Elladan, Dewey's martial skills improved at a startling rate. Where once he had been a frail, bookish wizard, he now could meet orcs in the open without relying on magic, wielding his flame sword or the spear Aeglos with confidence. During that time, he drank another draught given by the Ents. The Ent draught made him grow a little taller, just over 2 meters, and more importantly, it strengthened his body. While its effects lasted, he felt full of energy every day. Even the hard training from Elrohir and Elladan left him vigorous and only more powerful. Dewey brewed several more growth potions and sent Thorondor, his great eagle, to Fangorn to trade them for Ent draught with Treebeard. Thorondor was no longer a fledgling. Under Arwen's careful feeding, with those enchanted rations called lembas, his wings had grown strong enough for long flight, and after Dewey gave him Ent draught, his size doubled. Treebeard, taken with the bird, treated him again, and when Thorondor returned to Weathertop, he had doubled in size once more. He was bigger than any living eagle anyone had seen, a wingspan approaching 30 meters, each beat of his wings stirring a wind like the fabled rock. Once he could fly, he needed no one to feed him. The folk of Hogsmeade, at the mountain's foot, watched him set out each dawn to hunt in the wilds and return at sunset to his nest in the tall Malorn tree. On Bilbo's birthday, Dewey gave him a vial of Ent draught as a present. The change was immediate. Bilbo grew 8 centimeters and became the tallest hobbit in the Shire. He was delighted and threw a feast in Hobbiton so that all his neighbors could admire his new height. Days slipped by as Dewey and Arwen spent time together, and as Dewey trained with the elven brothers. Then a raven from Gandalf arrived with news. The dwarves of the Lonely Mountain had decided to mount an expedition to Moria. Balin would lead the company. Thorin Oakenshield would not go himself, but he gave Balin his full support to reclaim Khazad-dûm and restore its old glory. The dwarves had not come to that decision lightly. Moria was overrun with orcs, and the Balrog that dwelt in its depths was the gravest threat. No force of dragon or ordinary foe compared to the terror of a Balrog. Khazad-dûm had been ruined in a single night by that one terror. The dwarves were divided and hesitant, but Gandalf himself had ridden north to intercede, and he brought word that Dewey was willing to help. The news lifted their spirits. With Gandalf and Dewey at their side, and the possibility of Smaug aiding them, they believed their chances of success were much improved. "Duir, long time no see," Balin greeted when he stepped from the green flames in the hearth and saw him. Seeing Dewey's height, the old dwarf's eyes widened. "My goodness, Duir, what have you been eating? How did you grow so tall?" "A small gift from the Ents," Dewey said with a smile. Balin shook his head. "The Ents are not friendly to our kind. They had quarrels with our forebears. Fangorn has always been forbidden ground for dwarves." Dewey thought it unsurprising. Dwarves love to mine and shape the earth, and they inevitably cut trees in the course of their labors, actions that would antagonize the Ents, who were guardians of the forests. It was odd, he reflected, that Yavanna and Ale, the Vala spouses who gave rise to Ents and dwarves respectively, had children at odds with one another. Destiny has its ironies. They set out the terms of their alliance. Balin, as leader of the expedition and representative of the dwarves, pledged his full cooperation to Dewey. He promised that, if Moria were reclaimed, he would not accept rule from Thorin. Instead, Balin would become Lord of Moria, ruling autonomously, much as Dane Ironfoot held the Iron Hills. Generous beyond expectation, Balin offered Dewey half of Moria's recovered treasure and a permanent 1/10 share of whatever mithril the mine produced. 1/10 of all the mithril mined would belong to Dewey in perpetuity. Dewey was stunned by the offer. Mithril was rarer than gold and worth more than coin. The mithril shirt Thorin had once given Bilbo could buy the Shire. Khazad-dûm before the fall had been wealthy on its mithril wealth, far surpassing the Lonely Mountain. Balin's promise of a permanent 10th was an enormous and steady source of riches. Graciously, Dewey accepted. Smaug had long complained of poverty. Dewey thought this expedition would give his great companion purpose. Balin stayed only briefly. He would meet Dewey again in a month before leading the company back to Moria. Dewey, meanwhile, set about his own preparations. The Balrog was not a mere beast, but a Maya, a spirit of fire and shadow. It was a close combat foe whose power rivaled the greatest evils. Dewey knew he could not rely on bluster. He had to prepare for its flames. He turned to potioncraft. From memory of events in another world, memories of a Hogwarts dungeon and the black flames that Professor Snape had set to guard the Philosopher's Stone, Dewey tried to reproduce the fire-resistant potion that had allowed someone to pass through those merciless flames. That potion, though it would not withstand fiend fire, withstood most magical fires. Dewey did not know whether a Balrog's fire resembled fiend fire, but he would be safe if he could resist everything short of that worst-case magic. For ingredients unique to Middle-earth, he sought counsel from Radagast the Brown. The hedge wizard and herb master knew every plant at his command and gladly supplied local substitutes matching Snape's potion's properties. There were a few unfortunate explosions and singed beards along the way, but at last Dewey perfected a brew that, by his tests, proved even more resilient than the original. He experimented cruelly but effectively. He captured an orc, forced the potion down its throat, and then exposed it to fiend fire. The orc stood in the inferno for a few seconds longer than a normal orc might before ashes claimed it. Encouraged, he repeated the experiment with another orc and a larger blaze. The second one endured for over a minute before the flames consumed it. The durations were short, but they gave Dewey confidence. He continued brewing, and by the day arranged with Balin, he had prepared 5 pots of the fire-resistant potion, enough for a small band. When the appointed day arrived, green flame lit the hearth and Gandalf and Balin stepped out of it, Balin bearing an iron chest. Gandalf studied Dewey with a smile. "Duir, you have changed. You look more like a warrior. Have you been training?" Dewey nodded, touching the corners of his mouth as if to hide a memory. "Elrohir and Eladon have been training me." Gandalf laughed softly, catching the whole context at once. "You took their precious Evenstar. Not being driven from Rivendell shows the Elves' good breeding. I remember the tale of Beren who sought Luthien, how Thingol demanded as bride price a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown to discourage him. You are fortunate. Elrond is not one to make needless hardship. He has given you counsel and made you stronger." Dewey smiled without bitterness. "I know, Gandalf. Lord Elrond and his sons care for Arwen very dearly." He paused, then asked, curious, "Where have you been all this time? Convincing the dwarves shouldn't have taken so long." Gandalf did not hide what he had been doing. "I rode to Dunland. Saruman has been stirring there, reaching out to orcs and trying to win the Dunlendings to his side. I wanted to see whether there was a way to stop him." Chapter 163, Water Watcher. Duir read Gandalf's face and saw no hint of good news. "So it didn't work?" he asked. Gandalf nodded and sighed, his expression grave. "The Dunlendings and the Rohirrim have old grievances and land disputes. Someone has been stirring them up, whispering into their wounds. The Dunlendings now hate the Rohirrim even more and have been drawn into an alliance with that instigator to try to take back their lands. I tried to persuade the Dunlending chieftain to let go of his hatred, and then I went to Rohan to beg the king to set aside a piece of land for them. But that person has so poisoned their minds that they no longer want merely to return to their homeland. They want to conquer all of Rohan. Worse, the Dunlendings suspected me of being a Rohan spy. I was nearly imprisoned. If not for the flying broomstick you gave me, I wouldn't have escaped Dunland at all." Duir's face grew worried. "Do you think the Dunlendings will tell that person you were there? If they do, it could bring trouble." Gandalf shook his head and for once smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I visited Dunland a long time ago, trying then as now to broker peace. If that person knows I've been there again, he'll think I'm repeating my old futile efforts and perhaps mock me for it. He won't suspect anything new." Duir relaxed immediately. Balin, watching, was curious about the unnamed schemer, but prudently kept his questions to himself. Once the matter with Gandalf was settled, Duir turned to Balin. "How many dwarves have you brought? What's the plan?" Balin, armored and confident, patted the iron chest at his side. 1,000 of our best warriors, all fully equipped. I packed them into the box you enchanted." Gandalf added, "We'll strike Moria from the west gate at the foot of the Misty Mountains. The Elves of Lorien will mount a pincer at the eastern rear entrance. We'll clear the orcs inside before we confront the Balrog, without warning it if we can help it." When Balin opened the chest, the sight was impressive. 1,000 dwarves in carefully forged armor, weapons ready, hammers, axes, swords, grim and prepared as war machines. Among them were Oin and Ori, both of whom Duir recognized from the Lonely Mountain expedition. There was iron determination in every set jaw. Duir didn't delay. He roused Smaug in the cellar vault. The dragon was sluggish at first, but mention of Moria's treasure, surely rivaling the hoard under the Lonely Mountain, awakened him. Even the rumor of a Balrog seemed an acceptable risk in exchange for plunder. Next, Duir went to the Chamber of Secrets and called up Heilbo, the serpent monster. Duir himself nearly stared at its growth. In a year, it had shed several skins and reached 50 feet, the size of a full-grown basilisk. Feeding constantly on giant spiders, and after it had devoured the Spider Queen Shelob, had transformed Heilbo. Dark magic surged through it. Its gaze grew deadlier and its venom far more potent. Duir sealed the basilisk in a spatial box and carried it away. Gandalf eyed Duir's caches and could not help but exclaim, "You've come well prepared." Duir shrugged. Facing a Balrog required every advantage. With the dwarven chests secured, the basilisk and Smaug awake, Duir, Gandalf, and Balin mounted Smaug and flew southeast. Thorondor, the great eagle, shadowed them, too young to be a principal warrior, but useful for scouting the skies and relaying messages to the elves watching the east gate of Moria. They crossed the South Downs and the Greyflood and passed over the ruins of Eregion. Gandalf gave a brief account as they flew. After the War of Wrath, survivors of the Noldor had migrated east and founded Eregion at the foot of the Misty Mountains. There the elven smiths traded with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Metals and crafts passed hands, and the two peoples prospered. It was also in Eregion that Sauron, disguised as Anatar, taught ringcraft to Celebrimbor and the Gwaithemyrdain, forging the rings of power. Later, Sauron's treachery destroyed that peace. Eregion was sacked, Celebrimbor slain, and the land left to ruin. Celeborn and Galadriel had once been founders, but after the betrayal and the fall, they parted ways. Galadriel withdrew through Moria to Lorien, and Celeborn lingered no longer in the shadowed passes. Below them, the great road from Eregion still led to the doors of Duir. Smog set them down near the silvered gates at the foot of the misty mountains, where a broad, dammed lake lay like a dark eye at the entrance. Balin opened the dwarven chest with a shout. "All right, lads, out you come! Moria's right here!" Dwarves tumbled free, cursing the cramped space and bantering about who had farted in the box. As they did, Duir's smile faded. He stared at the black water of the lake. He remembered. Frodo and his companions had been waylaid here, attacked by a thing the rangers called the Watcher in the Water. It had closed the gate with writhing tentacles, pinning them to the pass and forcing them onward into the darkness. Gandalf, who had been studying the doors, glanced up at Duir's expression. "What is it?" Duir pointed to the lake, voice low but urgent. "There's something dangerous in that water. I can feel it." Gandalf's face hardened. He peered into the murk but saw nothing, then straightened and barked, "Do not go near the lake. There is something in it." The dwarves ceased their jests and froze, confused, then followed Balin's order. "Hold this side! Form up! Keep guard!" Shields were raised in a solid wall facing the water. Helmets glinted. Axes and hammers were at the ready. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, and then a massive, sickly, pale tentacle struck the shield line like a falling tree. The dwarves were hurled back, shields buckling beneath the blow. Another tentacle lashed and wrapped around Oin's leg, hauling at him. Ori swung his axe and cut the limb away, freeing his comrade, only to see more tentacles whip up from the lake, 20 or more, seeking to draw men into the black water. "Diffindo!" Duir cried, and the air crackled. Blades of magic severed several tentacles wrapped around the dwarves. Gandalf drew Glamdring and began to hack at the writhing limbs, each stroke sending slashed flesh and black ichor flying. The thing in the lake replied to the blows with fury. The water roiled, and something vast and island-sized rose from it. It was an enormous octopoid horror, its body a mass of rubbery flesh and dozens of thick, curled, pale green tentacles. It reared, and dozens of its limbs smashed toward Duir and Gandalf like battering rams, gouging the ground where they struck. "The Watcher in the Water!" Gandalf shouted, diving aside as a tentacle tore a deep groove across the earth. Duir slashed with his wand and sheared one tentacle cleanly off. The severed limb fell and writhed like a dying python. But the creature was unrelenting. More than a dozen other tentacles smashed down, blurring the air with their speed and mass. Duir's face tightened. He threw up a shimmering shield. "Protego!" The barrier flared and took the blows, tremoring from each impact. The dwarves did not merely stand back. Some loosed barbed arrows into the creature's mass, while others surged forward with axes and hammers to chop and hack at the limbs. Time and again, the Watcher's strength sent them sprawling, black water spraying as dwarves were flung and came away stunned. Then Duir shouted, "Exploding bolt!" A scarlet lance of energy leapt from his wand and detonated amid the nearest tentacles. The force was blinding. Flesh and limb shredded into flying fragments. The Watcher screamed, an awful, cavernous sound, and momentarily drew its remaining tentacles back into the lake. Relief flared among the company. They thought the fight was at an end. But as the dwarves gathered themselves, the severed tentacles across the shore began to twitch. A sick green glow seeped along their torn edges, and, to everyone's horror, the amputated limbs began to knit and regrow at a visible, horrifying speed. Flesh reknit, skin smoothed, suckers reformed. Within heartbeats, the slashed tentacles were whole again, and the Watcher, humming with renewed life, advanced once more. A stunned silence fell. Duir stared, eyes wide. No one had told him the Watcher could heal itself like this. The dreadful realization spread. This foe would not be felled by simple cutting. Chapter 164. Flood the Watcher in the Water's regenerative ability caught Dewey off guard. He remembered that when the Fellowship had encountered the creature, it hadn't shown that power, but then that clash had been over in an instant. The Fellowship had retreated behind Durin's gate the moment the tentacles struck. No one had seen the Watcher's full range of abilities. Watching its severed arms knit and reform before his eyes, Dewey remained calm. If its healing was strong, he had just the thing to counter it, a dark arts spell he'd learned specifically to prevent healing. He raised his wand. An invisible bolt of magic shot out. Sectum Sempra. Sectum Sempra didn't flare with light or fanfare. It was a silent, invisible blade of force. One massive tentacle split down the middle as if riven by an unseen sword, and crucially, it did not grow back. At the wound, something in the magic forbade regeneration. Dark blue blood poured steadily from the tear. Encouraged, Dewey fired again and again. Dozens of thick tentacles were sheared off. The lake took on the color of spilled ink, and a rank stench rose from the water. "Well done, Duir," Gandalf called, his eyes bright as he watched Dewey's work. The dwarves cheered and brandished weapons. Above them, Smaug swept low and belched a gout of flame into the lake. The Watcher flinched. Half its appendages were gone, and the magic that had allowed it to mend itself had been thwarted. For a moment, a look of fear passed across the creature's enormous eye. It jerked its remaining tentacles in and sank beneath the surface. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Had the monster retreated? The lake lay still. Is it gone? Will it not strike again? Balin peered toward the water, voice cautious. Gandalf's expression grew grave as he stared at the lake. "The Watcher is older and fouler than orcs. I've seen little of its kind. I do not think it retreats without reason." "What do we do?" Balin asked. With a water-dwelling predator hiding in the basin, no one could safely approach Durin's gate. Gandalf looked troubled. Dewey's jaw tightened. He had been watching the shore closely, and now he pointed. "Gandalf, look at the waterline. The lake is rising." Gandalf followed his gaze, and his face went white. The lake's surface was creeping outward, silent and swift. He spun and sprinted for the nearest tree. "Run! The flood is coming!" Like a much younger man, he climbed up the trunk and urged the others, "Get up the tree. Hold tight to the trunk." The dwarves scrambled up trunks that remained standing. Dewey pulled a flying broomstick from his spatial pouch, mounted it, and rose into the air. In moments, the whole basin seemed to turn inside out. The lake's water bulged and then surged over the banks like a tipped basin. An avalanche of water hurtled toward the high ground. Some dwarves who had been slow to climb were swept off branches. Trees snapped and toppled, flinging their occupants into the roiling flood. Dewey watched below, brow knotted, and shouted, "Smaug! Thorondor! Help!" Thorondor dove like a thrown spear, snatching two struggling dwarves and dropping them onto an unfallen limb. Smaug scooped up several more in enormous claws. Dewey dove between waves, using a levitation charm to steady those being swept away and guide them to safer trees. From his perch, Gandalf used his staff as a pike to pull two men clear, then cursed as he remembered his own broom. He, too, drew it from a pouch and joined the rescue. But the Watcher in the water was not content to let them have an easy time. Hidden beneath the flood, its powerful tentacles smashed tree trunks and plucked dwarves off branches, letting them fall like dumplings into the churning water. It kept its body concealed beneath the waves and struck from underwater, forcing everyone to stick to rescue work. "Duir," Gandalf said, helplessness in his voice. "It controls these currents. We can't reach it while it fights from within the water. We need a way to force it out." Dewey thought for a beat and then reached for the leather case that had been slung at his side. "Hailbow can move in water. Maybe he can threaten the Watcher." He cracked the case open and hurled it into the lake. A tentacle lashed out and tried to drag the box under. In an instant, a gigantic snake's head burst forth, clamping down on the tentacle and injecting venom. The appendage wreathed and released the case, retreating into the depths. Dewey's eyes shone. Basilisk venom was deadly. One drop would fell an elephant, and only phoenix tears could counter it. If the Watcher had been bitten, perhaps it could be poisoned. But the creature was not slow to react. It bit off the poisoned section of its own limb, isolating the venom. A 10-meter section of severed tentacle floated, and the Watcher continued to keep itself buried and wary. "Hailbow, kill that thing!" Dewey hissed in Parseltongue. The basilisk's eyes closed as if in agreement, and it plunged after the Watcher. Beneath the surface, the water churned into a violent melee. Then, strangely, the already darkened water turned jet black, as if someone had poured ink into the lake. Dewey felt a cold prickle run down his spine. The basilisk's greatest weapons were its eyes and its venom. In murky, ink-black water, sight became nearly useless. Hailbow emerged, shaking droplets from his scales. Dewey asked in Parseltongue, "How goes it?" The basilisk's voice came back in Dewey's mind. It could not open its eyes. The Watcher had sprayed ink, blinding it before it could strike. The Watcher had also tried to entangle Hailbow, tearing at him with tentacles, and it had used the currents to keep the snake from closing. The basilisk's venom had bitten a tentacle, but the Watcher had sacrificed limbs to isolate the poison. They were at an uneasy standstill. Dewey frowned. The beast was hard to fight in the water. Trying to drag it out would be harder. He turned his attention downstream, and a plan took shape. Long ago, the Sauron had flowed by Durin's Gate. Over time, the downstream had been dammed, forming the barrier lake that now swallowed the West Gate. If they could drain that barrier lake, the Watcher would lose the water it used to hide and strike from, and be far less dangerous. Gandalf's face brightened at the thought. "Your minds are quick, young one. My head grows old and slow." "But we cannot simply break the dam," Gandalf warned. "This lake has been held for 1,000 years. If the barrier collapses, the rush will flood everything downstream and harm innocent folk." Dewey nodded, thinking rapidly. "Then we'll open a small breach and let the water out slowly. No cataclysm. We'll divert it." While Bilbo kept the Watcher occupied beneath the surface, Dewey flew to the dam. It was an obvious man-made structure of rock, deadwood, and packed earth spanning the valley. The Watcher had built its barrier to expand its territory. Dewey ordered Smaug to open a diversion channel along the mountainside. Using his tail like a great excavator, the dragon carved a spillway. The lake funneled down the new channel, swelling the Sauron, but not turning it into a ravaging deluge. As the water level fell, the Watcher grew frantic. It thrashed to tear the channel apart, but Smaug loomed at the spillway and repelled every assault with flashes of dragon fire. Bilbo continued to harass the monster in the depths, keeping its attention divided. At last, when the level had dropped low enough, Dewey fired an exploding bolt at the weakened remaining section of the dam. The breach burst open, and the last of the lake poured out. With the water drawn away, the Watcher in the water could no longer keep its body submerged and hidden. The full, terrible form of the creature was exposed in the shallow basin, massive, armored, and furious, no longer content to skulk in the dark. The true confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 165, Durin's Gate. They had seen part of the Watcher in the water before, but nothing prepared them for the creature in full. It was enormous, its body some 50 meters long, its tentacles several times that length. Including those writhing limbs, it would have rivaled Smaug himself, stretching perhaps 150 meters end to end. Hard, scale-like plates covered its hide. The dwarves' sharp arrows glanced off without leaving even a scratch. Now fully exposed in the shallows, the Watcher writhed and bared fangs and claws, trying to frighten them away. For all its fury, however, it felt diminished. No longer hidden by the lake's dark waters, its menace lacked the terror of the unknown. With a few quick flicks of his wand, Duir severed one tentacle after another. The creature shrieked, then tried to flee upstream. It was not merely a monstrous animal, but one of Morgoth's foul creations, born of the underground waters of the Misty Mountains. When the dwarves of Khazad-dûm had delved ever deeper for mithril, they had disturbed more than the Balrog. The Watcher in the water had followed their tunnels to the surface and turned the outflow into a barrier lake to survive. All it wanted now was to return to the safety of the subterranean rivers. Duir refused to let it go. "Smaug, burn it to cinders," he called, and the dragon obeyed. Smaug swooped down, hanging before the creature and unleashing a gout of searing flame. The fire licked over the Watcher's flesh, making it hiss in pain. It thrashed wildly, spraying dark ink that snuffed the flames, but its flesh, especially the severed tentacles, had been singed red and smelled of roasting meat. One of the dwarves, nose twitching, couldn't help his appetite. His stomach rumbled audibly. His companions stared, and he laughed sheepishly. "Isn't it about dinner time? I'm a bit peckish." Seeing the way to the surface barred by Smaug, the Watcher darted downstream, right into the lair of another predator. The serpent basilisk Bilbo, which had already been lying in ambush, fixed the fleeing monster with that terrible gaze. The Watcher's great eyes met a pair of yellow, killing eyes, and in an instant its vast body froze. Where a living beast had writhed a heartbeat, before now stood what looked like a colossal octopus carved from weathered stone. Duir flew close, puzzled. Direct eye contact with a basilisk usually killed outright. Why had this one been turned to stone instead? He hovered at the Watcher's head and discovered the answer. A transparent protective membrane covered the creature's eyes. It had not looked straight into Bilbo's gaze, but had seen it through that film, enough to petrify, but not to smite. Gandalf came over on his broom and tapped the statue with his staff. It sounded like stone. Balin joined them, peering up at the immobile behemoth. "Is it dead?" he asked. "It's not death," Gandalf said. "It's a petrifying curse, deep and hard to undo." Duir nodded. If it had met Bilbo's gaze directly, it would have been instant death. The membrane saved it from that, but the basilisk's power still worked, turned it to stone. Petrification like this is very difficult to reverse. From what I know, even Dumbledore once struggled with basilisk petrification. Only a potion brewed from mandrake can restore the living. Without such a cure, this creature is as good as a statue. A different thought occurred to Duir then. In another world he knew, there was an enormous octopus dwelling in the Black Lake. Here at the foot of Weathertop, his own Black Lake lacked a guardian to prevent stealthy approaches by water. A subdued watcher in the water would serve well. His collector's impulse flared. He already had a dragon, a giant eagle, and a basilisk. Why not add an octopus? He used an undetectable extension charm to enlarge the leather case that held Bilbo, then gently tucked the petrified watcher inside beside the basilisk. Gandalf raised an eyebrow but wasn't surprised. Considering Duir's menagerie, another addition seemed almost expected. Balin, however, breathed out in relief. "We hadn't even reached the doors of Durin and already faced such a horror," Balin said. "If it weren't for you and Gandalf, I dread to think what we'd have met." Duir only smiled. He remembered the grim history that had befallen Balin's people in the original timeline. Balin had led 500 dwarves to reclaim Moria and initially had some success, driving out orcs, claiming treasures, even calling himself Lord of Moria. But soon, disaster followed. Balin was slain at Mirrormere. Orcs swarmed through the east gate along the Silver Lode. The dwarves were overwhelmed, the stronghold breached. Those who tried to flee through the west gate met the Watcher in the water. Oin was dragged into the lake and drowned. The survivors retreated deeper into Moria and, dwindling, eventually perished in the chamber of Mazarbul. In that doomed march, they never even saw the Balrog until too late. Here, however, Duir's timely intervention had changed the course of events. Thorin Oakenshield had lived and grown to be king under the mountain. Balin's foray into Moria had been launched decades earlier, and thanks to Duir dealing with the Watcher, might yet succeed. If fortune held, the tragedy that had consumed Balin's company could perhaps be averted. At last, they reached the doors of Durin. Set flush into a smooth stone wall between two tall holly trees, the doors were almost invisible, but Gandalf was not at a loss. He had stood before Durin's gate long before Khazad-dûm fell to shadow. He had even searched here for Thrain the Second. He tapped the wall with his staff and smiled. "They're here, between those two trees." He explained the gate's craft. Celebrimbor of Eregion and Narvi of Durin had wrought it together, and the lines on its face were drawn in mithril-born Ithildin, visible only by the light of moon or stars. "So we wait until night?" Balin asked. "When the moon or stars can show us the words?" Gandalf nodded. Duir stepped forward and pressed his staff against the wall, murmuring, "Alohomora." Nothing gave. "The gate's strong," he said. "No charm will force it. Only the right word will open it." Gandalf raised an eyebrow. Then Duir smiled. "Not necessarily," he said. "Isn't the light of Arendelle considered starlight?" He drew a small crystal vial from a pocket of his spatial pouch. Within it shone a concentrated, pure starlight, the very light of Arendelle. Gandalf's eyes lit at the sight. "Of course. How could I forget?" Duir held the vial up and let its radiance wash over the stone. Where the starlight fell, silver-white lines blossomed, the outline of a great door, delicate filigree of trees and crescent moons, a many-pointed star at the center. Across the top gleamed a row of Sindarin characters, and beneath them the emblem of Durin, an anvil and hammer, a crown, and 7 stars. Duir read the inscription slowly, translating the curved letters: "The Lord of Moria, Doors of Durin, speak, friend, and enter." "You know Sindarin?" Gandalf asked, surprised. "I learned it from Arwen," Duir said. "Many of the scrolls in Rivendell are in Elven script. I had to learn it to read them." Gandalf gave a approving nod. Then all three of them regarded the inscription again. "Speak, friend, and enter?" Balin repeated. "What password? It's clear enough." Gandalf said. "If you are a friend, say the password." Duir smiled. "Melon." The word was small in the night air, but enough. The lines shimmered, and the doors swung open as if expecting them. Balin and the dwarves broke into quiet cheers and hushed joy at the sight of the open way. Duir and Gandalf, however, exchanged a glance of sober caution. Both knew a great danger lurked beyond Durin's gate. They had come prepared, but what waited inside Moria would test them yet. Chapter 166. Orc Attack. Durin's gate opened at last, and the dwarves, filled with awe, were the first to step inside. Smog, however, was far too immense to squeeze into the tunnels, and Moria's passages were narrow and winding. Duir ordered the dragon to fly to the east gate on the far side of the Misty Mountains. The Balrog had been seen near Durin's bridge, close to the eastern approach. Smog could enter from there and meet them so they could deal with the Balrog together. He sent Thorondor to keep watch over the sky above the west gate to stop any orcs from slipping away. At the threshold, Gandalf spoke sternly to the dwarves. "Be careful. There is an evil here older than the Watcher in the water, hiding deep below. Do not wake it unless you are absolutely certain." The dwarves fell silent. They had all heard the tales of the Balrog. Weapons were gripped, and eyes scanned the shadowed corridors. Moria was a labyrinth of interlinked ways. Without someone who knew the routes, it was easy to be lost forever. Fortunately, Gandalf had been here before and led them up a rising stairway. They passed endless, bottomless shafts, remnants of Khazad-dûm's mithril mining. Even the walls along the corridor held veins of ore that gleamed silver when lit. What had once been commonplace for their forefathers now shone like treasure to the assembled dwarves. More than one hand twitched toward the stone. Gandalf kept them moving. At the top of the stair lay the 21st Hall on Moria's 7th level. Moria counted 21 great halls, numbered east to west. The first hall nearest the east gate, the 21st nearest the west. The dwarves had driven their minds steadily westward, carving a tunnel through the Misty Mountains, an achievement that spoke of their unmatched craft. Even walking from West Gate to East Gate took 4 days. The 21st Hall was a cavernous chamber held up by massive pillars, with doors in its 4 sides. Here was also the chamber of Mazarbul, the repository of Khazad-dûm's records. Balin's face fell as he looked at the ruined books. Time and orc destruction had turned them to dust. Nothing could restore them now. Then his eyes lit on an object set upon a stone table. "Durin's axe!" he cried and ran to it, lifting the ancient weapon as if it were a family relic, because it was. Durin's axe, heirloom of Durvdurus, was a symbol of rule and a treasure beyond price. Balin cradled it like a found friend, elated. Before Duir could make more of the library, an arrow whistled from the dark and flew straight for Balin's neck. Duir reacted in an instant, casting a shimmering shield that halted the shaft a hair's breadth from Balin's throat. The dwarf took a long, shaky breath. "You saved my life," Balin said, awed. Gandalf drew his sword and cried, "Prepare yourselves, orcs!" Drums answered far off in the hollow. Roars and the tramp of many feet came up the passages. Duir flung a globe of clear light into the air. Its brightness filled the hall and revealed what was coming. From each of the 4 doors poured a flood of orcs, tightly packed and savage, and among them were dozens of cave trolls, towering brutes armed like siege engines. The dwarf warriors split into 4 ranks and guarded the doors. Though outnumbered, they held the choke points. Orcs fell in waves. The dwarves' armor and discipline made each doorway a death trap. The attackers, however, pushed ahead with brute force. Huge, armored trolls were sent forward to smash the gates. One drove a giant hammer into the stone and burst a breach. Duir unleashed a lash of lethal energy that sent the first troll reeling and shouted to Balin, "Leave the great beasts to Gandalf and me. You stop the orcs." Balin nodded, with Durin's axe in his hands, joined the dwarves in the slaughter at the east doorway. Duir and Gandalf, meanwhile, focused on the trolls. The brutes were not only huge but resilient to simple spells. A direct killing blast would injure them, but not always fell them. Duir did not panic. With a clever sweep of his staff, he touched the carved figures high on the north and south walls, statues of past dwarf kings and mastersmiths several meters tall. Stone loosened, and the statues stepped free from their niches. They strode down into the hall, sweeping orcs aside and grappling the trolls. Where a troll had strength, the statues had weight and stubbornness. Several forced a beast down and bound it. Duir vaulted onto a statue's shoulder with the spear Aeglas in hand and drove it through a troll's skull. The creature went limp, its head crushed. He then released Bilbo from its confinement, a serpent-like horror whose yellow eyes burned with a dreadful power, and sent it to guard the west gate. Duir himself took command of the north gate, standing among the animated stone giants. Gandalf led the defense at the south, while Balin and the dwarves held the east. Bilbo's effect was immediate and terrifying. Any orc who met its gaze either died at once or fled in panic. Those who avoided looking into its eyes recoiled before its presence. The West Gate attackers halted, unwilling to risk it. Gandalf, in the south, fought with his staff in one hand and his foe hammer in the other, moving with calm skill, sending concussive blows and shockwaves to finish off the trolls. Balin's band, 1,000 strong, repelled attack after attack at the east. All the while, the dwarves' fine armor kept them largely unharmed. Orc blades glanced off mail and plate. In the north, with the statues as a living bulwark, Duir could pick his moments and drive the enemy back. The conflict dragged on until more than half the attackers lay dead or broken. With a frenzied drum signal, the remaining orcs retreated into the dark. The dwarves cheered. Twice their number had fallen this day. Duir closed Bilbo back into its leather box. A weapon that could kill with a glance was too dangerous to keep loose while so many friendly eyes were about. After pushing the fallen into the abyssal shafts, they rested, briefly, and then marched on. Gandalf led them east through the 20th, 19th, 18th halls and beyond. Small parties of orcs harried them here and there, but the dwarves dealt with every attack. Duir and Gandalf conserved their power. The deeper they went, the sterner their faces became. At the second hall, the assault turned into a nightmare. A sea of orcs surged toward them, thousands, packed tight as grain. Countless cave trolls came with them. Some swung iron clubs, others hauled crude catapults. The orcs had anticipated Bilbo and blinded many trolls, lashing themselves astride the beasts to guide their attacks. Orcs, having long lived in dark caverns, could fight by sound and smell even without sight. Several closed their own eyes so the basilisk's stare would hold no sway over them. Confronted by such numbers and cunning, Duir acted without hesitation. He spoke a binding word, and the stone above a great mine shaft shattered, raining huge boulders and masonry into the approach. The collapse crushed scores of attackers and swallowed their path. He shattered stairways and sealed passages to deny the orcs alternative routes. Gandalf planted his staff into the floor and struck with both hands. A white wave of force rolled outward, hurling orcs and trolls aside like threshed grain. The assault wavered and then broke. For the moment, they had driven the tide back. Gandalf turned to Duir, his eyes troubled. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "The air is warmer." Duir met his gaze and nodded, sensing the same dread. Our true enemy draws near. The air around them had grown oppressively hot, a sure sign the Balrog was coming. Duir and Gandalf both felt the change with the same cold certainty. They could not squander their strength fighting the orcs and risk being caught off guard when the true enemy emerged. "Don't get bogged down with the orcs. Cross the bridge of Khazad-dûm and make for the first hall," Gandalf bellowed to the dwarves. "Those orcs answer to something older and stronger. It's about to come up from below." Balin wasted no time. He ordered the dwarf warriors to push east at full speed. The dwarves pressed the breakthrough. Duir and Gandalf held the rear. They moved as a single, urgent stream, not daring even a pause. The sudden heat made the armored dwarves sweat. It was more confirmation than any words. The Balrog drew nearer. The orcs never relented in their pursuit. When they noticed the change in temperature, their fear twisted into an almost ecstatic frenzy. They worshipped and feared the Balrog with equal intensity. In Moria, the orcs were vassals of that flame demon. They gathered its intelligence and enforced its rule. Azog, whom Duir had killed, had been their leader and a servant of the Balrog. In a sense, by confronting and slaying Azog, Duir had already become entangled with that ancient evil. They cleared the last of the orcs and reached the bridge of Khazad-dûm at last. The bridge spanned the chasm between the first hall and the second hall, a narrow 50-foot strip with no railings, only wide enough for a single file. It was an old dwarven defensive work, meant to be the last line of defense. The architects had never imagined an enemy would rise from beneath it. Flashes of fire winked deep in the abyss. Gandalf peered over the edge, face grim. Quickly! Cross the bridge! Getting 1,000 people over a narrow bridge was never going to be instantaneous. Duir acted without hesitation. "Engorgement charm," he cried. The planks and stones shuddered and lengthened, widening into a broad causeway that could hold 12 people abreast. "Hurry," he ordered. The dwarves surged forward, hope returning to their faces as they ran for the far side. Duir and Gandalf kept their backs covered. Duir drew 2 small vials from a pouch and thrust one at Gandalf. "A fire-resistant potion. I brewed it ahead of time. It can even hold against fiendfire for a moment. Drink." Gandalf took the cool vial and drained it in a single swallow. His face brightened. "Thank you. That will help." Duir swallowed his own potion as well, and an instant of cold washed through him, banishing the burn of the surrounding heat. They had barely a heartbeat to prepare. The last dwarf stepped across, and a whip of living fire lashed up from the abyss and cracked toward their position. Duir's wand was already in his hand. No, it shifted to a staff in his grip, and he roared, "Pertigo Maxima!" A vast, shimmering barrier erupted from the staff and took the lash of flame. Ripples ran across the shield where the fiery whip struck. Seeing Duir hold the line, Gandalf shouted to the retreating dwarves, "Don't stop! To the first hall! Go to the east gate!" Balin glanced back at the blazing maw of the abyss and the whipping fire and did not hesitate. He led his folk away. With the dwarves on the bridge and their escape secured, Gandalf and Duir turned their full attention to the thing that had risen below. The fire from the chasm recoiled and then flared again, almost casually. A gigantic wave of orange-hot flame blasted across the bridge and struck the far side. Orcs, unlucky enough to be caught by it, were consumed in an instant, turned to ash, while the ones who watched did so from a distance, trembling with reverence and terror as though they were witnessing a god at work. Through the heat and smoke, a colossal shape took form, a giant of shadow and flame. A seething core burned in its chest, its eyes were yellow embers, its head, horned like a raging bull, crowned with a mane of fire and steam. Shadow wings folded on its back, and a long, burning tail trailed behind. It was the Balrog, a fallen Maya, a furnace of living fire whose heat melted the stone about it and steamed the air. Perhaps the Balrog expected its very presence to scatter them. When Gandalf and Duir stood firm, it became only angrier. It seized a great sword that burned with black smoke and swung it down at them. The blade smashed into Duir's barrier and splintered it. "Duir, lend me your sword of flame," Gandalf shouted. Duir drew his own flaming sword and flung it to Gandalf. The old wizard caught it and raised his voice, not in any modern spell, but in the old tongue of power. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. The dark fire shall not avail you, flame of Udun." The sword's blaze changed from orange to a searing, white, holy light. Gandalf slammed it against the Balrog's burning greatsword, and the impact sent shockwaves through the bridge. Both combatants were driven back several paces. Duir did not hesitate. He planted his staff, filled with every ounce of power he could muster, and screamed, "Avada Kedavra!" A blade of sickly green light shot from the staff, crackling with lethal intent. The Balrog answered with a furious sweep of its burning sword. Deathlight and flame met with a thunderous explosion. The green radiance detonated outward in a blinding glare and a concussive blast, shattering the Balrog's greatsword into molten fragments and blasting the creature backward. The force shoved both Duir and Gandalf off their feet and sent a rain of hot sparks down into the chasm. When the smoke thinned, the Balrog remained, battered, missing a weapon, but far from destroyed. Duir had hoped the killing curse would at least cripple it. Instead, it had done little more than break one of its swords. The failure sat heavy in his chest, but there was no time for regret. The Balrog roared, and a tide of infernal flames surged toward them. "Aguamenti!" Duir cried, and a column of cold, tumbling water rushed up to meet the fire. But the Balrog's heat was relentless. The water hissed and steamed as it vaporized. Duir could only keep replenishing the flow, trying to hold a watery wall between them and the flames. Gandalf brought his staff and flaming sword together, sending out a ring of brilliant light. Back into shadow, servant of Morgoth. The radiance blossomed into a bulwark that drove at the demonic fire and pushed it back. The Balrog lashed with its whip of flame. Each strike gnawed away at Gandalf's luminous shield, chiseling it down until, with a straining groan, the barrier shattered. Gandalf staggered. He leaned on his staff, breathless and shaken. Seeing Gandalf falter, Duir acted swiftly. He drew something from a hidden spatial pouch and hurled it across the space between them and the Balrog. A battered leather suitcase, nothing grander to look at than that. The Balrog swung its fiery whip to strike it down, meeting the case with a lash that should have reduced it to ash. Instead, the case winked open in a scatter of impossible geometry, and whatever stable space had held its contents collapsed. A deluge of water poured out, a volume like a small lake, born out of nowhere, and crashed directly onto the Balrog. The surface sizzled and steamed as if cooling red-hot iron, and for a moment the creature appeared taken aback. Along with the water, something else sprang from the exploded case, a massive stone likeness of the Watcher in the water, the very guardian of the lake outside Moria. The Balrog knew that form well. They had been neighbors, both born of the deep, and its burning eyes showed a flash of puzzled recognition. But it was not given the luxury of curiosity. It lashed out to burn the obstruction to ash. Then, from the Watcher's open mouth, a serpentine head shot out. Basilisk Hylbo had been hidden inside the statue's maw, its yellow, serpentine eyes locked on the Balrog, and it fixed it with the deadliest of all gazes. The Balrog, though mighty and ancient, was not immune to the basilisk's influence. It staggered as if struck, its thoughts clouded, and its mind slipping into a brief, disorienting blankness. The gaze could not kill Amaya, but it could still snare and bewilder. Duir seized the opening like a hunter pouncing on prey. He planted both hands on his staff and funneled every ounce of his power into one raw, lethal spell. Avada Kedavra! This time the green light did not just arc, it roared into being, a thick bolt of emerald lightning like a great harpoon. It screamed through the steam and the fire and struck the Balrog full in the chest. Avada Kedavra struck the Balrog full in the chest. The creature howled, its flames sputtering and guttering. Dewey leaned on his staff, breathing hard, a grin of triumph slipping across his face, until his pupils suddenly narrowed. The Balrog, freed from whatever hold the basilisk's eyes had had on it, lashed out with its flame sword. The Watcher in the water, that had been blocking its path, and the basilisk that had been ambushing it were swept aside like twigs and hurled into the bottomless abyss. Before Dewey could worry about Hylbo, the serpent, the Balrog gave a low, terrible roar. The surrounding fire seemed to surge toward it and be swallowed whole, like a whale taking in water. Its dimmed flames flared up anew. With a gesture, it conjured a flame scepter. It brandished the scepter, and a hotter, more violent wall of fire fountained out toward Dewey and Gandalf. Dewey's face tightened. He slammed his staff down and poured every ounce of magic into his voice. Super Protego, Protego Totalum, Impervious. A vast word sprang into being, enveloping him and Gandalf. Even so, the Balrog's inferno was so intense, the surrounding rock began to liquefy. The shield shivered and thinned, melting under the heat. Worse, Dewey's fire resistance potions were starting to wear off. The heat stung his skin. He didn't hesitate. He rattled several more potions from his pocket and downed them, then thrust one into Gandalf's hands. Gandalf, drink. If you don't, if the Balrog doesn't kill us, the heat will. Gandalf tipped his head back and swallowed. He faced the flames, gripping Dewey's flame sword. For the first time, the fire ring on his finger, Neria, shone openly, pouring out a warm, brilliant light. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. No evil spirit may pass. Narya answered. It drew in countless embers and fed them into the sword so that the blade erupted in white-hot fire. Gandalf and Dewey were engulfed in a storm of flame, an unholy, shadowed blaze from the Balrog clashing with something like a holy fire. The mine filled with a searing sea of orange and white. Orcs caught in the conflagration were reduced to ash. Supports and walls melted into molten ruin. Relief flashed across Dewey's face. If not for the potions, they would have been roasted alive. Seeing Gandalf hold his ground, Dewey fumbled for the crystal vial at his staff and drew forth Erendel's light. Lumos, he intoned. What had been merely a bright charm became something far stronger in the vial's presence. Erendel's light burst out, white and pure, with a cleansing quality that pushed back the darkness. It blotted out the Balrog's fiery glow and made the creature real. The Balrog shrank away from the light, beating its shadowy wings in an effort to shield itself. Dewey and Gandalf began to press the advantage, but both men knew how precarious it was. Their combined power might hold for a moment, but it would not be enough in a long fight. If they couldn't finish the Balrog quickly, they would be the ones to die. A thunderous roar rolled in from the direction of the first hall to the east. Both of them turned hopefully, and a moment later a colossal shape burst through the mountain face. Armor-clad and winged, the dragon Smaug descended, beating huge wings that sent showers of dust and stone flying. "Master, I'm here. The great Smaug has come to aid you." "Less talking, more help," Dewey snapped. Smaug puffed proud smoke and obeyed. He unleashed a gout of dragonfire at the Balrog. The blaze struck true, but the Balrog did not dodge. It stood and drank in the dragonfire. The infernal creature absorbed every lick of it, letting the added heat feed and strengthen its own flames until its presence became more intense than before. Smaug stared, flabbergasted. Dewey's face hardened. "You idiot, you breathe fire at a creature of living flame?" he barked. "Stop wasting your breath. Use your body to pin it." Smaug, ashamed, lunged. At over 100 meters long, he could not be ignored. Even without his fire, Schnaufer, his size, scales, and armored hide let him grapple with the Balrog. As a fire breather, he did have some natural resistance to the Balrog's flames, though he was no match for a fallen Maya. The Balrog's whip lashed him, burning his scales crimson, and Smaug roared. He bit and tore, lashed with claws and tail, tried to rend or even swallow the Balrog. The dragon's assault drew the Balrog's attention and helped ease the pressure on Dewey and Gandalf. Even if Smaug could not truly defeat the Balrog, he could occupy it. At that moment, the system finally chimed. "Hogwarts Sign-in System. Location Moria. Do you wish to sign in?" Dewey's heart leapt. He thought only one thing. Sign in, now. He punched the prompt mentally. "Sign in. Do it." Sign in successful. "Congratulations, you have obtained Grindelwald's improved Fiendfire curse." A memory flooded him. Grindelwald's work on Fiendfire, raw, utterly destructive fire that consumed almost anything, even Horcruxes. Fiendfire was notoriously uncontrollable. Few dared cast it. Grindelwald had been an exception. He had found a way to temper it so it could distinguish friend from foe. To those loyal to the caster, the flames would not harm. To enemies, they would rend and erase. Dew didn't hesitate. He cast. A cold blue inferno leapt from his wand. Unnatural, hungry fire that scoured the mine as it roared outward. It devoured every flammable thing in its path, even eating into the Balrog's own blaze. The torrent of blue fire coalesced by his will into the shape of a second Balrog, all blue flames and howling heat. Gandalf froze at the sight, then realized with mounting surprise that these fiendfire flames did not burn him. For him they were cool, merely crackling without pain. The Balrog, meanwhile, snarled. Its gaze snapped to the blue imitation. Under Dewey's command, the Fiendfire Balrog charged. The true Balrog flung out its whip of flame to meet it. The two titans clashed. Blue and orange fire braided and fought, the heat making the very air shudder. The Fiendfire devoured combustibles and became more fearsome. For a time it engaged the Balrog to a standstill. Yet the Balrog was no mere illusion. It was a fallen Maya, ancient and masterful in fire. Slowly, the real Balrog tore the Fiendfire form apart. The blue flames collapsed and dissipated. Dewey watched helplessly as his creation unraveled. He thought of the tale where Gandalf and the Balrog fell into the chasm, and the Balrog's fires were quelled by the deep water below. He had tried water before, only to see it evaporate instantly. Maybe there was a specific kind of water. He turned to Gandalf. "Gandalf, what sort of water will put out a Balrog's flames?" Gandalf's eyes widened, then brightened. "Ulmo," he said, "the Vala of waters. He is lord of all waters. Where there is flowing water, there is Ulmo's domain. He hates Morgoth's works and his servants. Balrogs are restricted where Ulmo's waters touch. If we can lure the Balrog into a true body of water, it may be extinguished, at least weakened." "Which water?" Both looked without speaking to the bottomless chasm yawning below. "I can feel moisture down there," Gandalf said. "There must be water at the bottom." Dewey nodded. He knew it too. The question was how to get the Balrog to follow them into the abyss. Back on the bridge, Smaug's struggle was growing desperate. The Balrog's flame scepter spat new jets of infernal heat, melting the dragon's armor and scorching his scales a brutal red. Even with resistance to flame, Smaug could not take the constant bite of that dark fire. He gave a raw, painful roar. Gandalf stood his ground on Durin's bridge, white and burning, sword roaring with light. He baited the Balrog like a shepherd luring a wolf. The Balrog sneered with cold yellow eyes, nostrils vomiting embers, the huge whip of flame hissing and striking. The whip moved like a living thing, setting the very air alight in its wake. Gandalf dodged and countered, his sword meeting the whip. Sparks and a booming crash vibrated through the bridge. The impact sent him stumbling back as the sword's light dimmed. The Balrog pressed forward, triumphant and mocking. Dewey did not wait. He loosed another Avada Kedavra. The fierce spell headed straight for the Balrog. The creature instinctively swatted its whip to intercept. The whip shattered against the killing curse. The spell fizzled into nothing. Seizing the moment, Gandalf drove his staff down in a thunderous blow. The bridge answered with a sound like breaking earth. The stones beneath the Balrog buckled and splintered. The section of bridge under the Balrog gave way. For an instant it hung on the edge, and then it fell. The Balrog dropped into the abyss with a roar that shook the mountain. For a breath there was triumph. Then a whip of flame leapt up from the depths and lashed around Gandalf. "Protego!" Dewey shouted, and his shield took the hit. The fiery coil snapped back. But the whip was relentless. It snaked outward again and fastened itself to a jutting ledge of rock at the cavern's lip. With that anchor, the Balrog hoisted itself, climbing up the living fire as though it were a ladder. Dewey reacted instantly. He called Aeglos, the divine spear, and poured everything into it. He drove the spear into the stone with a force that split the rock. Cracks spidered outward. The remaining half of Durin's bridge and the jutting rock over the abyss fractured and collapsed. They broke away and tumbled down, smashing onto the Balrog that was hauling itself up below. Stone and weight hammered into the creature as it climbed, striking to drive it back into the dark. Chapter 169, Unnamed Creature. "Smaug, take us down, now!" Dewey and Gandalf leapt onto the dragon's back. Smaug folded his wings and plummeted into the yawning chasm beneath Durin's bridge. This was no dwarven quarry, but a natural fissure, a bottomless black throat cut into the mountain. Even the old dwarves had never measured its depth. Wind screamed past them, stinging their faces. In the void, it was impossible to tell how long they fell. Minutes, an hour, perhaps longer. It was so dark they could barely see their own hands. Pressed against the dragon's scales, they were spared most of the wind and could keep their eyes open. When it seemed they could fall forever, Smaug suddenly beat his wings and slowed their descent. "Master," he warned, "the Balrog is below, and it's climbing up." They peered into the black and saw a flicker of fire that quickly grew into a terrifying blaze. The Balrog was scaling the smooth stone wall with its long, flaming whip lashing out. The once cold air around them began to heat. The demon noticed them and, furious, fixed them with a red, blazing gaze. It roared and ran across the cliff face as if it were flat ground, charging upward. Dewey produced the last 3 vials of fire resistance potion. He handed one to Gandalf and one to Smaug, then drank the third himself. When Smaug swallowed his potion, he shivered. The familiar fire in his belly went nearly out, and for the moment, he could not breathe dragon fire. "Master?" Smaug asked in surprise. "Don't let the Balrog escape. Hold it tight," Dewey said. "If it falls into the water at the bottom, its power will be greatly reduced." The Balrog's fiery whip lashed out and wrapped itself around Smaug's leg. Smaug found, to his relief, that the flames did not burn him. He bit down on the whip, hauled the Balrog upward, and then clamped onto it. Both beast and demon fell together. The Balrog thrashed and sent torrents of infernal flame outward. Dewey and Gandalf were engulfed in fire, though the potion shielded them, for now. They knew the protection was temporary. If they could not end the fight before it wore off, they would be badly burned, perhaps killed. Gandalf had lost his staff in the fall, but he still had his sword and hammer. Leaping from Smaug's flank onto the Balrog's back, he drove Flame Sword into the demon and hammered with his other weapon as they fell. Dewey could hardly breathe from the wind and the heat. He clung to the dragon's scales, closed his eyes against the stinging air, and poured everything into one spell. Golden bell grounding. The world lurched as if 1,000 pounds had been dropped on them. The sudden change in momentum stretched the Balrog's flames into a long, scouring tail. The sensation nearly flung Duir free. He grabbed Smaug's tail to hold on. Then a blast of cool vapor rushed past them. The bottom was near. "We're almost at the water," Smaug shouted over the wind. Sensing the deep water, the Balrog erupted into even hotter flame. Fire licked at them. Duir felt combustion on his skin despite the potion. His clothes and his spatial bag crackled and burned away. The bag burst open, and its contents scattered into the torrent below. There was no time to lament lost gear. Duir snatched the divine spear Aeglos and lunged. He drove it deep into one of the Balrog's eyes. The spear detonated with savage force, shearing away half the demon's head. Fire poured from the wound, and for a heartbeat the Balrog faltered, though its flaming flesh began to knit itself back as the infernal blaze tried to heal the wound. The wound bought them a moment, and in that moment they broke through to the abyss's hidden lake. Dampening and speed reduction. Duir cried. They hung a few inches above the water instead of smashing into it. The Balrog had no such mercy. It plunged straight in, creating a thunderous splash and the harsh, hissing sound of flame meeting water. After a second, the three, Duir, Gandalf, and Smaug, slammed into the frozen black water. It felt like being immersed in an ice cave. The water was numbing, a chill that seemed to seize the blood in his veins. Around them, there was pitch darkness. Duir let out a small orb of light to pierce the gloom, and in that circle he saw Smaug, Gandalf, and the Balrog. Gandalf's voice rang like distant thunder from the water. "Evil thing, this is Uomu's domain. You have no power here." True to his words, the Balrog's flames sputtered and went out when it struck the lake. The towering inferno became a viscous, black, almost gelatinous mass. It was still dangerous, but far weaker, down by at least one whole tier of power, roughly on par with Gandalf now. A hiss came from the water nearby, and a great serpent surfaced, eyes half shut in apparent delight. "Master, you've come down too," the creature said. Hylbo, the basilisk Duir had known, rose, sleek and enormous. Duir felt relief and surprise at once. When the Balrog had thrown Hylbo and the Water Watcher into the abyss earlier, Duir had feared for them. Hylbo bobbed in the water, eager for revenge. "Hylbo," Duir called. "Help Gandalf. Use your gaze and fangs on the Balrog." Hylbo darted beneath the surface and swam under the weakened demon. With a powerful bite, he sank venom into one of the Balrog's legs. The poison would not kill the thing outright, but it made the creature weaker still. Duir, meanwhile, used Accio to call back the items that had been blown from his spatial bag. "Gandalf, catch your staff!" Duir shouted and flung the staff toward him. The old wizard snatched it with a cry of happiness. A staff mattered far more against such an enemy than a sword. He spun it and cast a tremendous force that sent the Balrog reeling. Duir followed with the killing word of other tales. "Avada Kedavra!" The green death curse struck the viscous demon, and it howled in pain. Encircled by Gandalf, Smaug, Duir, and Hylbo, the Balrog's resistance collapsed. It broke contact and fled into a narrow, dark tunnel. "After it! Don't let it recover!" Gandalf barked. They pursued through the maze of tunnels beneath the lake. The passages were too small for Smaug, so he turned and carried the petrified Water Watcher back toward the surface. Duir mounted Hylbo and raced after Gandalf, who moved ahead with his staff alight. Hylbo followed the Balrog's scent with uncanny precision. The serpent needed no guidance. These tunnels were not natural. Someone, or something, had burrowed them, twisting and branching like a spider's web through the rock. Gandalf's face was taut with worry as he examined them. "What is it?" Duir asked. The wizard's unease was contagious. Gandalf's voice dropped to a whisper. "May the Valar protect us. We must not meet what lives down here. There are nameless things in these depths, ancient, alien. Even Sauron's knowledge does not reach them." Duir's stomach clenched. "What are they? What could be worse than a Balrog?" "I cannot name them," Gandalf said. "Only that they are older and stranger than most intelligences. The Balrog knows this place well. If it had not been driven mad, it would never have come here willingly." At that instant, the Balrog's flight changed. It heard, or saw something behind it, and the massive demon emitted a sound Duir had never heard. not a roar nor a shriek of rage, but a short, desperate, primal cry, full of terror. The Balrog turned utterly from them. It abandoned attack and fled in blind panic toward a tunnel that climbed back up. Gandalf's eyes went wide. "Quick, follow, run, do not look back." Bilbo drove forward with all his speed, beating through the water and into the tunnel like a living torpedo. Dewey nearly lost his grip as the basilisk surged. Dust and rubble began to rain from the tunnel ceiling as the earth itself trembled. Then something uncanny descended, a silence that was more than the absence of sound. It felt as if an invisible curtain swallowed up every rustle of breath and every footfall. Even the light seemed to be consumed. From the depths of the passage, an almost physical darkness flowed outward, not mere shadow, but a nothingness that erased color and form. An ancient whisper filled Dewey's mind, not heard by the ears, but vibrating directly within his soul. A single, formless voice full of malice and a cold, all-encompassing hunger. Primal fear slithered through him, a chill like a serpent coiling around his heart. They were not simply pursued by the unknown. Whatever dwelt below had noticed them. And whatever it was far older and far more terrible than any Balrog. Chapter 170, Death of the Balrog. Just as Dewey felt the darkness swallowing him, a warmth and courage surged through his chest, easing the paralysis in his heart. Gandalf had wrapped him in the power of Narya, the Ring of Fire. Instinct won out over fear. Without hesitating, Dewey channeled his staff and began the magic music Tom Bombadil had taught him. That music summoned a Patronus, a faint, trembling light in the black morass, pushing back the clinging shadow and granting a momentary reprieve. The dark presence behind them faltered at the music. Then its whispers sharpened into 1,000 needle-like pains, stabbing at Dewey's mind. The basilisk bearing them, Bilbo, struggled through the mire, slithering close behind the fleeing Balrog. The hunter had become the hunted. The Balrog, enormous and writhing, ripped a narrow corridor through the abyssal darkness with its bulk, and they rushed through the gap in the pure, pursuing black. Time stretched like an age. At last, a faint glow appeared far ahead. The Balrog surged forward. Bilbo followed with Dewey and Gandalf on its back, and they shot toward the light like arrows loosed from a bow. They burst out of the tunnel into a carved dwarven secret passage. The unseen thing's gaze still hung on them like a shadow, so they did not pause but climbed on, up through the passage. Only when they reached the lowest levels of Khazad-dûm did the nameless gaze finally relent. They collapsed into safety, faces white with relief. Dewey's back was soaked. He couldn't tell if it was cold sweat or water. "What was that thing?" he asked, still trembling. Gandalf inhaled deeply and did not elaborate. "A creature that dwells at the earth's core, gnawing at its foundations. Leave it be. Unless the end of days comes, it won't crawl to the surface. Thinking about it brings nothing but trouble." He turned his attention to the Balrog ahead, his expression hardening. "Ulmo's deep waters have doused its flame for the moment. We must finish it before the fire rekindles." The Balrog met their gaze, its eyes red with an ancient, undying hatred. The terror it had felt in the abyss had shifted into furious relief and bitter rage toward the ones who had nearly destroyed it. It bellowed, a roar that shook the caverns, as if expelling all the fear it had swallowed in the dark. Then, instead of charging, it turned and fled. "After it!" Gandalf shouted. They did not hesitate. The lowest dungeon of Khazad-dûm opened onto a spiraling staircase that climbed without end toward the heights. The Balrog fled upward. Dewey and Gandalf urged Bilbo to follow. The broomstick that had once flown them lay charred and gone, reduced to ashes by the Balrog's fire. So the chase was a brutal, ground-bound pursuit. On the endless staircase they climbed and fought in equal measure. Even without its full flames, the Balrog remained terrifying, viscous and malefic, its hooked claws deadly, its oily mass like a strangling, coiling serpent. Seizing an opening, Dewey gathered all the malice he dared to wield and cast Avada Kedavra. The curse struck the Balrog's viscous form. It screamed, its burning eyes dimmed, its aura flickered. Bilbo lunged in, fixed its gaze on the creature, and then sank its teeth into the Balrog's neck, injecting venom. The Balrog howled, ripped the serpent from itself with steel claws, and flung Bilbo aside. At that instant, Gandalf's sword, a blade wreathed in white flame, thrust into the Balrog's waist. The bright fire carved a grievous wound. Weakened and sensing death, the the Balrog tore free and fled upward, abandoning entanglement. Dewey and Gandalf were themselves badly wounded. Their robes hung in tatters, their skin was blistered from flame. Every breath carried a burn and the metallic tang of blood. Narya's warmth sustained them, but their souls were drained. Dewey, after pouring himself into repeated Avada Kedavra casts, felt his mind on the edge of collapse. Without the ring's aid, he could not have gone on. Still, they pressed the chase, step after endless step, perhaps tens of thousands, until a vast, jagged fissure finally yawned ahead, like the earth split by a giant axe. Cold, mountain air rushed down, biting and clear. They burst out together into sunlight and cold. Clarity returned all at once. The wind cut like 1,000 icy blades. Snow lay everywhere, a wide, white expanse. They had climbed into the misty mountains. Silvertooth Peak crowned the ridge. Before them rose Durin's Tower, carved from colossal stone. The peak was a ring of sheer cliffs that fell away into cloud and sky. No sooner had the Balrog reached that cold air than new flame erupted across its body. Its aura swelled, a flaming whip coalesced in its hand. But it was not the same as before. Its power had been greatly drained. The Balrog's blaze burned white-hot against the wind, as if to transmute its fear and fury into raw destruction. Its flaming whip lashed through the gale, sending waves of heat that could melt steel. "Exploding bolt," Dewey shouted, unleashing a supercharged spell from his staff. The bolt struck the flaming whip with a thunderous collision. The whip shattered into a storm of fiery meteors. Gandalf swung his staff and released a blinding wave of light that slammed into the Balrog and hurled it against Durin's Tower. Stone cracked and walls flowed like molten rock. Dewey and Gandalf continued to strike relentlessly, while Bilbo, though wounded, stared and prepared to deliver another devastating gaze. Then the mountain itself answered. Winds and clouds boiled under the eastern cliff, and a vast dragon tore free of the cloud line, beating powerful wings as it dove. Smaug descended, tail like a battering ram, and slammed the Balrog into Durin's Tower. The carved stone could not stand. Great blocks collapsed, crushing the Balrog beneath tons of falling rock. Its flames sputtered and faltered. They pressed the assault. While Smaug battered the creature, Dewey and Gandalf poured every spell and strike they could muster into the fallen foe. Above Silvertooth Peak, light flared, fires leapt, and dragon voices roared, an upheaval of weather as wind rose and clouds swelled. Gandalf's face took on a rare, fierce joy. He raised his staff and called into the storm. "I am the messenger of wind and cloud, the master of thunder. Foul flame of Udun, here beneath the sky you have no home." As if answering him, lightning flashed in the gathering clouds. A bolt thick as a pail of iron dove toward the peak. Gandalf caught it on his staff and thrust the lightning outward, directing it straight at the Balrog. The creature tried to resist with a mantle of fire, but lightning pays no heed to such shields. The fiery barrier collapsed. The bolt tore through the Balrog's mass, as if through paper. For a moment time halted. The unending flames about the Balrog guttered and went out like a candle snuffed. Charred, ugly flesh was revealed where flame had been. The fire in its eyes dimmed to ash. It could not reignite. Gandalf, having channeled the lightning, looked spent. His face was etched with exhaustion. "Duir, quickly, plunge the spear into its heart," he rasped. Dewey did not hesitate. He rushed forward, seized a long spear, and drove it deep into the burning core of the Balrog's chest. The creature unleashed one final, piercing shriek, an utterly soul-shattering cry that split the clouds and echoed through the cliffs of Silvertooth Peak, full of pain, rage, and final, bitter annihilation. Its flames died, leaving a viscous black husk that smoked of sulfur. When the Balrog fell silent and still, Dewey had nothing left. He collapsed to the snow, utterly spent, unable even to pull the spear free. He gasped, his body and spirit emptied, magic spent, skin blistered and scorched. Gandalf, too, was broken, his robes torn to rags, beard singed away, his body marked by burns, his staff looked like a charred stick. Yet both men smiled with a relief they had never known. The Balrog was dead. Chapter 171. After the battle. "Oh, Dewey, you look a right mess." Gandalf lounged on a rock, leaning on his staff and grinning at him. "If Arwen saw you like this, she might not want you anymore." Dewey, relieved and in a joking mood for the first time in days, shot back. "You're not exactly presentable yourself, Gandalf." Gandalf stroked his chin and peered at his ruined robes. "I have no beard, no eyebrows, and these gray robes are in tatters. If anyone saw me now, they'd think me a homeless old fool." "When did you ever have a beard like that?" Dewey teased. Gandalf pretended to be wounded. "Oh, my poor beard, so much care, and now it's gone." He fumbled at his belt and then withdrew his hand, rueful. "And my pipe and the tobacco, all gone. I could do with a puff to calm my nerves." Dewey winced. The pipe and the pipeweed had been turned to ashes in the fight with the Balrog. He could conjure a pipe well enough, but he could not make tobacco appear from thin air. After a moment's rest, they climbed down to the Balrog's corpse together. The creature's body, once a living furnace of flame, lay cooled and grotesque, blackened, still radiating a terrible heat. Dewey wrenched Aeglos, his spear, free from the thing's chest. There were no ordinary organs inside. Where flesh should have been was a furnace-like cavity. At the core, set deep in a shell of red crystal, something flickered. Gandalf watched Dewey pry the crystal free and explained, "The Balrog's heart is a magic crystal. It keeps the undying flame alive. Even if its body is slain, as long as that crystal lives, the Balrog can be reborn. Throw it in a volcano, and in 1,000 years it might rise again." Dewey peered into the crystal. As big as a large football, it was split by the spear's wound. Within the red gem, a cluster of black flames danced, contained by the outer crystal, but still emitting a heat that stung like fire to the flesh and to the spirit. He swallowed. "If I use it to make phoenix fire, will that be safe? Will the flame harm more than it helps?" Gandalf shook his head. "Once the flames in the crystal are purified, there will be no hidden danger. The undying flame's malice must be cleansed, not merely used." Relief eased Dewey's features. "Good, we should go. Balin and the others will be anxious." It was bitterly cold and high on the peak. Wounds burned, and energy was low. They set the Balrog's body onto Smaug's broad back and climbed aboard the dragon with him. Heelbo, the serpent monster, coiled itself round Smaug's leg and rode like a strange wingless serpent. Together they dropped eastward from the misty mountains, through clouds toward Dimrill Dale. While Gandalf and Dewey had fought in the abyss, Balin and 1,000 dwarves had not been idle. Orcs had entrenched themselves at Moria's east gate and throughout the first hall. Balin's warbands smashed them out and pushed them back into Dimrill Dale. The Galadrim of Lorien had been watching the approaches, and elves and dwarves trapped the fleeing orcs between them. By the time Smaug pierced the cloud and descended, the fighting in the dale was largely over. Dwarves and elves were busy clearing the field. From below, someone cried, "A dragon!" "No, it's Gandalf and Dewey," Balin shouted when he saw them, running forward, joy lighting his face. 10 days had passed since the collapse at Durin's Bridge and the fall of Gandalf and Dewey into the abyss. For days, Balin had believed the worst. He had gone back to the bridge himself and found it shattered. Wall and arch had crumbled. He had presumed all had perished. 2 days before, Smaug had flown out of the depths with news of the battle, but until Dewey and Gandalf returned safely, Balin could not rest. Now the dragon landed, and the two of them stepped off its back. Dewey, hobbling and scorched, found his gaze fixed at once on Arwen as she approached in elven battle dress, a sword at her hip and a staff in her hand. She moved like a Valkyrie out of legend, beautiful and stern. She had come with the Galadrim to sweep the orcs from the dale. Arwen's eyes were full of relief when she reached him. "I was worried about you," she said, reaching for him with a hand that then faltered, as if she dared not touch his wounds. Her fingers hovered, then dropped. Small winces crossed her face at the burns and cuts on his arms and face. "How did you get so hurt?" Dewey grinned and shook his head, trying for lightness. "Don't fret. These are surface wounds. A draught and a little rest, and I'll be as good as new." He tried to draw her attention away from his injuries. "We killed the Balrog," he said, nodding toward the black mass beneath Smaug's feet. "It looked majestic in flame, but its true form is ugly." Arwen's gaze skimmed the thing, then returned to him. From a spider silk pouch she had kept, she produced a bottle of Ent draught and handed it to him. "Drink this. It will mend you." Dewey blinked in surprise. "Isn't this the bottle I gave you? Why didn't you drink it yourself?" "It does little for me," she answered with a soft smile. "I saved it for when it was needed." No more words were necessary. The bitter cold on Silverlode Peak had numbed the pain, but on the warmer air at the dale the burns throbbed like an ember. Dewey uncorked the bottle, poured half into a second vial, and handed it to Gandalf. "Here, take some." Gandalf accepted gratefully, and they drank. In moments, the Ent draught mended scorched skin and eased their weariness. Magic flow returned, wounds knitted. What little of Gandalf's beard remained did not regrow, but his strength came back. Around them, the elves and dwarves gathered, staring at the Balrog's corpse with a mix of awe and fear. Even dead, the creature's aura spoke of ancient terror. For Balin, the sight was jubilation. The greatest danger to reclaiming Khazad-dûm had been killed. If the remaining orcs in Moria could be driven out or destroyed, the dwarves could take back their halls and the mithril beneath them. He promised Dewey and Gandalf that the dwarves would clear the rest themselves. There were a few thousand orcs left, but the dwarf warriors were more than a match. Dewey and Gandalf accepted. Their souls had been exhausted by the confrontation. They needed time to recuperate. Still, Dewey placed Smaug at the west gate to prevent any fleeing orcs from escaping. The dragon's presence would seal the pass, while Balin's forces finished the purge. Before leaving, Dewey used the dwarves' spare space chests to stow away what they had brought back from the abyss: the Balrog's body, the Watcher in the water that Smaug had recovered, and the basilisk they'd encountered. Then, escorted by Arwen and the Galadrim, Dewey and Gandalf set out toward Lorien to seek Lady Galadriel and the healing and counsel of the elves. Behind them, Balin and the dwarves set to work on the great task of reclaiming Moria, hopeful at last that the dark shadow that had blighted their halls for 1,000 years was at last laid to rest. Chapter 172, Heart of the Fire Demon Lorien, Caras Galadhon. In the hall of the Lady and Lord, Celeborn and Galadriel received Duir and Gandalf. "The Balrog in the mines of Moria, to think the two of you slew it. What a feat!" Celeborn exclaimed, admiration bright in his eyes as he regarded them. The upheaval on the mountain peak was even visible from Lorien. Perhaps in years to come, songs will tell of that battle, the Grey Wizard and the Black-Robed Wizard on the mountaintop, ending the last of the Balrogs and bringing peace back to Moria. Gandalf laughed and shook his head. "What would the verses say? Even you, Lord Celeborn and Lady Galadriel, with your sight, can look through mists." But for the folk below, all they would have seen was a peak swallowed by a blizzard, thunder rolling, lightning flashing, and tongues of fire belching from the mountain. "Someone will always know," Galadriel replied, smiling gently, her eyes like distant starlight. Her gaze fell to the two visitors' attire. The robes were conjured, transfigured garments, and she could see through such arts. "You look weary. Go bathe in the Nimrodel and wash away the dust. I will have fresh robes brought for you." They did not refuse. Familiar with the path, Duir and Gandalf made their own way to the Nimrodel. Duir waded in until the cold mountain water reached his chest. Its chill ran through him and made him shiver. The elves had sung many praises of the Nimrodel's restorative power, and it proved true. The river eased the ache from his limbs and the weight from his spirit. Sleep, heavy and sudden from spent strength, began to pull at him. Reclining with his upper body on the soft grass beside the stream, Duir dozed, half dreaming, half awake. In the haze, he fancied he heard an elven voice singing. "Wake up, Duir. Don't sleep too long. You'll catch your death." Arwen's gentle voice nudged him back to full consciousness. He blinked and found Arwen watching him kindly. "Arwen, what are you doing here?" he asked, still foggy. "Come out quickly. The Nimrodel relieves weariness, but the water is cold. You shouldn't linger," she answered, concern in her tone. Only then did Duir realize that Gandalf had left. Perhaps the Balrog's fire yet lingered in him. Despite the chill, he did not feel the cold as sharply as others might. He still complied and rose from the river. Arwen handed him a folded stack of white cloth. "You made these?" he asked, surprised. Arwen smiled and nodded. Duir took the robes and took her hand. "Arwen, you are too good. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her lashes fluttered like butterflies. Her eyes, bright as wells of starlight and spring water, curved with her smile. "All right, put them on quickly. Don't catch a cold." Then, with a teasing tilt to his expression, Duir asked, "Change here? No need to turn away?" A faint blush like morning dew colored Arwen's cheeks. With a small gesture, she summoned a veil of mist about him. "Stop joking, Duir. Change quickly. Gandalf and my grandparents are waiting." Under the mist he changed. When the veil dispersed, he stood in a white elven robe trimmed with silver, tall and slender, carrying an easy nobility. "How is it? Does it suit me?" he asked, spinning. Arwen's eyes shone. "It looks very good. It suits you well." They walked from the riverside through the Malorn groves to Galadriel's garden. Gandalf, Galadriel, and Celeborn looked up from their tea when they arrived. Seeing the two come arm in arm, Gandalf chuckled. "I thought you youngsters would arrive later. Youth has such vitality, not like an old man like me." Duir and Arwen exchanged embarrassed smiles and joined the circle. Conversation soon turned to the Balrog. Gandalf recounted the fall into the abyss, the pursuit from the lowest depths to the mountain's peak, and the nameless things they had encountered in the tunnels. As he described the peril, Arwen squeezed Duir's hand with a visible tremor of worry and relief. Celeborn's interest was especially pricked by Gandalf's mention of those nameless creatures. "I thought them legend," Celeborn said. "They truly exist deep in the earth?" Gandalf, remembering, still felt the chill. "So did I. Meeting them made the old tales real. I do not wish to dwell on it and give you nightmares. Yet, if the Balrog had not led the way, Duir and I might have walked into a far graver fate. In truth, the Balrog saved us." Duir agreed. The memory of those hollow, devouring gazes, a sense of absolute void and despair pressing in, made him shudder. He had not seen a true form, but the fear it inspired was greater than the dread he felt for the Balrog. It was a nameless terror. "What are those creatures? Why do they terrify you so?" Arwen asked. She had not heard the old legends of things that dwelt beneath the earth, and was understandably shaken. Galadriel rose and stood before the pool of water she kept as a mirror. With a gentle touch, she stirred the surface and spoke slowly. "They are ancient and mysterious, far older than orcs or even Balrogs. They were with the world at its beginning." Under her fingers, the water shimmered with fleeting images, dreamlike and evasive. Then the mirror went black, a viscous, dense blackness deeper than night, without shadow, without light. From it came a pressure of dread, and beneath that pressure came old whispers, as if something were nursing vast terror. Galadriel's gaze fixed on that blackness, as though she met the creature's sight. Then, before whatever awareness stirred could emerge, she waved her hand and cleared the mirror. "Was that one of those nameless things?" Arwen asked, still shaken. "There are beings that were not made so much as come to be," Galadriel answered. "Iarwain Ben-Adar, Tom Bombadil, is one such ancient curiosity. Ungoliant was born from the dark void that girt Arda, and below the earth there are nameless things. In the oldest tales, in the unlighted roots of the world, unspeakable things are nourished. They gnaw at the foundations until, at the end of the great music, they will burst free and devour all." She smiled and stroked Arwen's cheek to reassure her. "Do not fear for now. The end of days lies beyond ages. Even for elves, it is far beyond our ken. Perhaps by then the elves will no longer be." Duir, after the initial shock, found a strange calm. These nameless terrors were like other myths, Nidhogger under the world tree, Leviathan of other tongues, symbols of the world's end. He had not expected Middle-earth to hold such shadows, but the notion did not unsteady him now. The conversation shifted to the present. Duir took from his satchel the heart of the Balrog, a red crystal that hummed with heat. Black flames writhed within it, carrying a violent, destructive, corrupted aura. The power pressed at one's nerves. Balrogs, fallen Maya of fire, had once been beings of sacred flame. Seduced and twisted by Morgoth, their flames became evil, but not less potent for that corruption. "Duir," Celeborn said, frowning, "if you use such evil flames, you risk falling into darkness yourself." Gandalf smiled and answered, "The Balrog was a Maya of fire. Morgoth's corruption turned its sacred fire to evil. But if the corrupt fire can be cleansed, returned to its purer nature, then that fire can be used for good." Duir's plan was plain. He wished to forge from that unquenchable flame the phoenix's nirvana fire for his animagus form. If purified and transformed, his phoenix would surpass those known in other tales. Yet the danger was real. "Lady Galadriel," Gandalf said, "your power of cleansing is unmatched. Would you help us purify the Balrog's fire?" Galadriel looked at the ruby crystal, then at Duir and the pleading light in Arwen's eyes. She smiled and inclined her head. "I will." Chapter 173, Return to Moria. After Galadriel agreed to help purify the Balrog's fire, she took the red magic crystal from the table. The crystal radiated fierce heat, yet she seemed completely unaffected. Carrying it, she walked to the central fountain, followed by Duir and the others. At the center of the fountain once sat the crystal vial used to gather Arundel's starlight, that same phial of Galadriel which captured the last radiance of the two trees whenever Arundel streaked across the night sky. Galadriel set the blazing red crystal down where the vial usually rested, then tilted the phial and let the condensed starlight drip onto the crystal. When the starlight met the hot crystal, it hissed like water on hot iron. Arundel's light is the last living spark of the two trees. It can purify all darkness and evil. That is why it is perfect for tempering the Balrog's fire, Galadriel said quietly. Wisp after wisp of the crystal's corrupt aura curled away, unanswered, dissolving under the starlight. But the starlight itself diminished as it worked. The condensed drops that fell from the phial were consumed in the process. Duir watched and understood at once what that cost meant. Arundel's light was not easy to gather. Even under the brightest nights, it took a year to collect a single drop of stardew, and a whole vial required centuries, perhaps a millennium. As the starlight dwindled, the crystal that had been almost black with burning corruption faded into a pale red. Seeing the precious starlight running low in Galadriel's vial, Duir hurriedly reached into his satchel. "My lady, please use my bottle of Arundel's light." Galadriel shook her head. "This is enough. Arundel's light purifies the crystal, but it cannot by itself remove Morgoth's corruption entirely. To restore the Balrog's fire to its pure state will take more than a single draught." She dipped her right hand into the fountain and stirred slowly. The light of Narya, the ring of water, on her finger shimmered, and a powerful purifying force flowed from it into the water. The spring glittered silver, as if sprinkled with starlight. Immersed in that water, the crystal's raging black flames calmed, its heat ebbed, and the taint steadily lessened. "From now on, I will infuse the spring with cleansing power regularly until the flame imperishable is restored," she said, withdrawing her hand. "How long will that take?" Duir asked. "Not long," she replied. "About 3 years." 3 years? Duir blurted. For an elf, 3 years was brief. To achieve the Phoenix Animagus, he could afford to wait. But he could not simply idle. His research on the Philosopher's Stone needed to continue. He left the crystal to the spring's slow purification and remained in Lorien to recuperate. It took a month for the exhaustion of magic and the fatigue that had seeped into his soul to fade entirely. During that time, he also remade 3 flying broomsticks. Their previous brooms had been destroyed during the fight with the Balrog. This time, he used melon tree branches. The new brushes were faster and more responsive. He named them. 2 of them were christened Firebolt and Comet. Firebolt would be his, Comet Arwen's, and the third was intended for Gandalf. Just as he was settling into the peace of Lorien, a raven arrived bearing a letter from Moria. Duir opened it while musing that he ought to recruit owls as messengers too, and read the news. Balin and his company had fully reclaimed Moria. Many of the orcs were slain. Those who fled toward the west gate were met by Smaug, the dragon that guarded the western approaches, and none survived the dragonfire. Balin, now Lord of Moria, invited Duir and Gandalf formally to be his guests. Celeborn and Galadriel had also received invitations. Duir and Gandalf could not refuse. Celeborn, however, declined. He had never trusted the dwarves. His great-uncle Thingol had been slain in old days because of greed for a Silmaril, and Celeborn's resentment had kept him from entering Moria even during Erigion's fall. Still, he would not openly offend the dwarves who controlled the Mithril. He prepared a gift instead. Galadriel chose not to go either. Arwen, at Duir's invitation and representing Lorien, accompanied him to Moria. They traveled upstream along the Celebrant and reached Moria's east gate in Dimril Dale. Balin himself met them there. "Welcome, Gandalf, Duir, and the fair elf maiden. Welcome back to Moria," he cried, embracing each of them with genuine warmth and leading them inside. Moria's scale was staggering. Even traveling straight across the kingdom could take 3 or 4 days. For now, Balin had made the first hall their principal gathering place, and the feast that followed was loud, happy, and lavish. Duir examined the tableware, plates, cups, cutlery, each fashioned from mithril and gleaming with craftsmanship. He thought of how a small piece of mithril could buy fortunes above ground, Whole artifacts made of it were priceless. Here, however, such marvels were used without thought. Arwen, sitting beside him, shared his amazement. She had learned smithcraft from Galadriel and understood Mithril's true worth. She also knew that some fine elven arms were inlaid with mithril to make them lighter, keener, and more subtly enchanted. To see mithril used for everyday tableware in Moria surprised her. What surprised Duir next was when Balin had a dozen heavy iron chests brought forward and set before him and Gandalf. "What's this?" Duir and Gandalf asked in unison. Balin signaled the dwarves to open the lids. Inside were finished mithril vessels, jewelry, tools, and raw mithril ore. "Gandalf, Duir, you freed Moria from the Balrog and helped us reclaim our halls. I cannot thank you enough," Balin said. "Words alone are not enough, so I have prepared this." He presented 2 parchments written in Tengwar and moon letters rendered in mithril ink. "As my gratitude, I grant each of you 1/10 ownership of Moria's mithril ore. I hope you will accept." Duir was stunned. He had been promised a share if Balin's expedition succeeded, but he had not expected Balin to honor it so lavishly or to extend the same to Gandalf. There was no stinginess in Balin's offering, only sober generosity and a clear intent to bind powerful friends to Moria. Duir did not refuse. He signed the contract with the silver pen the dwarves provided. The ink, mixed with mithril, would never fade, and the parchment, treated giant lizard hide, was made to endure for ages. Gandalf declined the share, taking only a mithril pipe from the chest. He said he had no vast household or dependents to provide for, so the grant would be of little use to him. Balin looked faintly disappointed, but not with malice. Duir, curious, used a touch of legilimency to read Balin's thoughts and found them as open as his face: gratitude, and a shrewd hope that binding Duir and Gandalf to Moria by interest would help keep the kingdom safe. Afterward, Balin led them to the treasury. Even after centuries of theft and plunder, gold once studded every ceiling and corridor. The piles of gold, silver, and jewels that remained still took Duir's breath away. Khazad-dûm's wealth rivaled the treasure of the Lonely Mountain. Even with much stripped away, the vaults of Moria were a testament to the Old Kingdom's vastness and to the significance of what Balin and his folk had recovered. Chapter 174, Fire Demon's Lair. The treasury sat at the lowest level of Moria, reached by a special tunnel the dwarves had carved long ago. At its end was a door forged from a blend of mithril and refined iron. "This is the last treasury in Moria that still stands," Balin told Duir and Gandalf. "Its defenses are the strongest. All 4 walls are cast of mithril and iron, and the door responds only to a password known to dwarves. The orcs could never dig through it, so its hoard remained unplundered." Balin's voice grew rueful as he spoke. Khazad-dûm had once relied on its rich veins of mithril to amass wealth beyond imagining, so much, in fact, that even a great treasury couldn't contain it all. When the Balrog awakened and the kingdom fell, the Balrog took no interest in gold, but the orcs did. They looted and occupied what they could and continued mining mithril, shipping it to Barad-dûr to supply Sauron's forces. Only the first treasury, built with extraordinary foresight and defenses, had survived. "I spent several days finally unlocking the password," Balin added, and his face brightened. Perhaps Durin's folk foresaw the fall and hid what they could here. He pushed the heavy door open. Duir and Arwen stepped inside and could only stare. Firelight turned the hoard to a glittering sea of gold. The chamber was enormous, no smaller than many dwarven halls. A massive golden pillar rose in the center. The floor, walls, and ceiling were paved in gold. Piled in mountains were coins, jewels, ornate jewelry, and exquisite handiwork, treasure enough to rival the Lonely Mountain. Best of all for Duir, half of this hoard belonged to him. At the Lonely Mountain, he had taken only a 10th. Gandalf refused Balin's offer of riches in the old wizardly way. He took only a handful of coins for Shire tobacco. Duir had no such scruples. He pulled out his spatial bag and began filling it, quietly delighted at the thought of the people and pets back home, especially a wealth-loving dragon who would benefit. Balin had no objection. To him, the real prize of Moria was not the coins and gemstones, but the mithril veins below. The treasury's plate and trinkets were incidental. As long as the mine remained, limitless wealth would follow. Before they left, Balin asked Duir to set up a flue network at the fireplace in the first hall. He offered a trade, 1 gram of mithril for 1 gram of flue powder. Dewey, always practical, accepted at once and even began scheming how to increase flue powder production without doing all the work himself. Balin hesitated, then added, "There is one more thing. The richest mithril lies at the bottom of the pit where the Balrog nested. If we are to mine properly, we cannot avoid that area. But ever since the Balrog, that pit has become a land of lava, full of sulfur and poisonous gases. My folk cannot approach it." "Would you ask us to go and see to it?" Balin finished, looking to Dewey and Gandalf. Both men were surprised. With the Balrog gone, they reasoned, the fires should have died down. Could the Balrog have cracked into a deeper volcanic seam? Curiosity and duty alike pushed them to agree. They rode their flying broomsticks to the rim of the mine pit and dropped down. The pit was several thousand meters deep. As they fell, the air grew hotter and hotter. At the bottom, a river of molten rock flowed, and the stench of sulfur was thick. Dewey cast a bubblehead charm around himself and Gandalf to keep the fumes at bay. Then, leaning his staff over the lava, he called Aguamenti. A geyser of water surged forth, streaming over the surface and turning to steam. Where water touched molten rock, a shimmering silver crust formed, mithril in liquid form, cooling to a mirror-like sheen. They realized with a jolt that much of the lava was melted mithril ore, exceptionally pure. But one narrow molten channel refused to cool. Even as steam billowed around them, a glowing throat of heat continued to spew metal. The passage breathed flame. It was unmistakably the Balrog's former lair. Dewey produced 2 bottles of fire protection potion. After they drank and layered on wards, they entered the glowing passage. Heat licked at them from every crack. Lava oozed and seethed. If not for the potion and their protections, they would have been burned to cinders. The passage opened into a vast circular cavern, the Balrog's lair, set on a black rock platform above a sea of lava. To their surprise, the cavern walls glittered with a thick crust of red, translucent crystals, fire crystals born of the Balrog's flame and magic. The crystals themselves seemed to radiate heat and a faint elemental fire aura. No wonder the lava below had not cooled. "What are those?" Dewey asked, pointing. Gandalf's eyes softened with wonder. "Fire crystals, formed under the influence of a being of flame, tens of thousands of years in the making. They are rarer than mithril. With them you can forge fire-imbued weapons or make items resistant to flame. They're invaluable." Dewey's grin spread ear to ear. Gandalf shook his head amusedly. "Just take a sliver for me to use as tinder. I need only a little. The rest is yours." Seeing Gandalf truly did not covet the hoard, Dewey stopped resisting his greediest urges and set to work. He used his spear, Eglos, to pry crystals free and place them carefully into a mithril box enchanted with an undetectable extension charm. Even through the fire protection potion, the crystals burned his hands. In ordinary containers, their heat would have melted through. Only mithril could contain them without damage. Gandalf loaned Dewey a flame sword and joined in, cutting and chipping until the cavern was stripped of its red crystals. As they worked, the cavern's temperature fell noticeably, though from a deadly inferno to merely a furnace. With the crystals gone, the place would cool on its own over decades. The lava would eventually solidify into cold mithril ore. But Dewey and Gandalf had pledged to help the dwarves, so they did not wait for time to take its course. Together they cast a powerful ice charm, quelling and freezing the remaining molten flows. The lava solidified into bright, silvery rock across the chamber, and they stopped only when the last of the heat was gone. Gandalf held up a small fragment of fire crystal. When his finger, ringed with the ring of fire, brushed it, the shard seemed to lose its burning character and become a smooth red gem. He slipped it into his pocket and warned, "These crystals are born of the Balrog and bear its taint. You must purify them before use." "How?" Dewey asked. "Expose them to direct sunlight. That will slowly cleanse the evil. Using Arundel's light in your hand will hasten it. Best of all, use both together." "I understand," Dewey said, grateful. He bowed his head briefly to Gandalf, then began planning how best to transport and purify his new, dangerous treasure. Chapter 175, Mother of Mithril. After harvesting the last flame crystals from the Balrog's lair and letting the magma sheet cool, Dewey looked around. His gaze settled on an enormous black stone platform at the center of the chamber. It bore scorched marks and deep claw gouges, undeniable signs that the Balrog had once made this its lair. Gandalf, do you think this stone hides something? How could it have survived the Balrog's fire without melting? Duir asked as he approached, running his hand over the singed surface. Gandalf had noticed it long before. He nodded. Even Mithril would not withstand the Balrog's fury. For this to remain unscathed is remarkable. He tapped the black surface with his staff and let a little magic spill from the tip. Fine cracks spidered across the stone like a shell splitting, and the blackened outer layer began to peel away. Beneath it shimmered a silver core, emitting a gentle inner light. The black crust had been nothing but hardened magma. The true material lay beneath. Duir stepped closer, breath caught by the silver glow. Gandalf's face brightened with surprise. He raised his staff again and struck the stone forcefully. The remaining shell shattered and fell away. Before them stood a raw, silver-white mass, nearly 2 people tall, its surface flowing with a soft, star-like radiance that lit the entire cavern. "Is this mithril?" Duir asked, puzzled. Mithril could reflect light, he knew, but it didn't normally glow from within. Gandalf's eyes shone. "Not ordinary mithril. This is the Mother of Mithril." "The Mother of Mithril?" Duir had never heard the name. He felt the word carry weight. "It is the wellspring of Moria," Gandalf said, reverent. "The source from which mithril in Moria is born. As long as it endures, the mines will never truly run dry." He laid a hand on the stone and seemed almost awed. The Balrog's flames failed to destroy it, and in a strange way, the heat has purified it further. "One single block of Mother of Mithril is worth more than the entire mithril workings of Moria," Gandalf added. Dui's eyes widened. He had expected value, but not this. "If I take a few fragments, would that harm it?" Gandalf hesitated, then nodded. "Take only a few pieces. This is the foundation of Moria. We must not be greedy." Duir used his divine spear, Eglos, to pry away fist-sized fragments. When he had taken 3, Gandalf put a hand on his arm. "No more. If we remove too much, we risk damaging it. If the mines of Moria were to be emptied because of our greed, that would be a grievous sin." Duir accepted the rebuke and stopped. He kept 1 piece, gave 1 to Gandalf, and intended to offer the 3rd to Balin. Gandalf accepted his share, but frowned at the idea of telling Balin. "The Mother of Mithril is extraordinary," Gandalf said. "Even the wisest dwarf would find it difficult to resist. Think of the Arkenstone and Thorin's line. Such things stir obsessions. If Balin knows, he will not rest until he secures it for the dwarves. That could lead to ruin. The very thing that keeps the mines alive could be exhausted by his zeal." Duir fell silent. Gandalf was right. Trust and human, or dwarven nature, were fragile. The Mother of Mithril was the lifeblood of Moria. Once its existence was revealed, the consequences could be far-reaching. "Keep the remaining piece for yourself," Gandalf suggested. "But there is a better use than hiding it away. Find a small iron vein near Weathertop, there's one at the foot of the hill, and bury the fragment deep within. The Mother of Mithril will slowly radiate and transform the ore around it into mithril. It will take a very long time, perhaps only a gram a year, but it would renew the supply. It will also form a natural magic field that benefits the area." Dui's face lit up. He remembered the small, ignored iron seam the dwarves had found when they built Hogwarts Castle. If the Mother could convert that, it would be perfect. By Gandalf's insistence, Duir accepted the final scrap and nodded. "All right, now for the last task," Gandalf said, clapping his hands. "We must ensure no one else finds it. Only if the Mother remains hidden can it continue to replenish mithril." Gandalf faced the silver stone, raised his staff, and began chanting an old, complex spell. Duir drew his wand and traced runes across the Mother of Mithril, then cast a disillusionment charm, a confundus charm, and finally wove a fidelius charm to bind the secret of its location. They covered it with enchantments until Duir felt confident that not even a reborn Balrog would find it. When they finished, Gandalf slammed his staff into the cavern floor. The earth shuddered. A deep fissure yawned open beneath them, bottomless to the eye, and the Mother of Mithril slid into the darkness. The crack sealed as quickly as it had opened. Gandalf relaxed and wiped his brow with a small smile. "There, safe." "We should go. Balin will be worried," Duir said. They retraced their path through the lava tunnel, collapsing the Balrog's lair entrance behind them to hide all traces. Then they mounted their broomsticks and flew upward, emerging to see Balin and Arwen waiting at the cliff edge. Balin's shoulders sagged with relief at their return. Arwen glided forward, concerned. "Duir, are you all right?" she asked. Dewey smiled, his eyes soft. "I'm fine. Don't worry." Balin hurried to Gandalf. "How are things below, Gandalf?" Gandalf laughed, the sound bright and sure. "The magma was only the Balrog's lingering power. Duir and I have dealt with it. The lava has cooled and solidified. No danger now." Balin breathed easily. "Thank you both. I don't know how we would have managed without you." Dewey turned to Balin with a grin. "There's more. Once the lava cooled, it left behind very pure mithril. You won't have to mine it. Just smelt it." Balin's eyes shone. "Truly? That is wonderful news." With that worry lifted, Balin insisted on a celebratory feast. After 2 days in Moria, Gandalf, Arwen, and Dewey prepared to leave. Dewey chose the west gate. He escorted Arwen to a hearth in Moria's first hall and helped her step back to Lorien. Gandalf, uneasy about Saruman's remaining influence and the possibility of his further plots, left by the east gate and set off toward Fangorn Forest to enlist the Ents as quiet observers. Dewey rode the great dragon Smaug at the west gate. He had one more stop to make, the ruins of Eregion. Smaug raised an eyebrow but obeyed. Dewey leapt from the dragon and landed where the rings of power had once been forged. No sooner had his boots touched the ancient stones than a system notification popped into being before him. Hogwarts Sign-in System, location, Eregion. "Do you wish to sign in?" "Sign in," Dewey said. "Sign in successful. Congratulations. Goblin Forging Craftsmanship unlocked." Chapter 176, Fairy Craft, Goblin Forging? Dewey stared for a moment, then a grin spread across his face as he read the details more closely. In the wizarding world, goblins were famously clever, culturally distinct, and the shrewd managers of the great wizard banks. But they were also peerless artificers, far superior to most wizards at metalwork. The goblins of legend had forged items like the Sword of Gryffindor, a blade that absorbed beneficial magical substances and could even take on properties that let it destroy Horcruxes. In many ways, they were the counterparts to the elven and dwarven smiths of Middle-earth, but with one major advantage: goblin-forged weapons could grow. They absorbed ambient magic over time, becoming stronger instead of weakening. If Dewey learned goblin craft, he could stand alongside elf and dwarf masters, and his creations would literally get stronger with time. Even better, the sign-in had done more than teach him techniques. Dewey suddenly felt his sensitivity to metal and to magic sharpen. Holding a lump of mithril, he could sense its latent potential and imagine how best to awaken it. He could read the magical eddies around artifacts. It was a massive boon, and he was thrilled. "Let's go, back to Weathertop Castle," he told Smaug, patting the dragon's scaled flank. The great dragon beat its wings, lifted him into the sky, and bore him toward Weathertop. Hogsmeade Village spread beneath them in bright, busy life. The settlement had grown into a bustling town, nearly a city, with streets stretching from the lake to the east-west road. The fields beyond lay in neat, sprawling patchwork. People moved through the town in a relaxed, prosperous bustle, residents and newcomers alike, travelers, merchants, bards, and adventurers. Bards lingered by the Black Lake, singing the praises of Weathertop Castle and the 2 great golden and silver trees that had become symbols of the place. Merchants set up stalls and made good profits. The townsfolk paid reasonable taxes and spent freely on necessities and comforts. Because of that prosperity, Mr. Buttercup of the Prancing Pony in Bree had opened a branch in Hogsmeade and left his son in charge. Bree's decision to join Duir's realm had tightened the ties between the towns. Residents of both places increasingly mingled, trading, marrying, and treating themselves all as Dewey's subjects. Bree, of course, still benefited from being at the crossroads of the east-west and north-south roads. And with the Barrow Downs dark magic drained to feed Dewey's basilisk, the whites there were no longer a problem, which meant Bree saw more trade with the Shire. A number of hobbits, mainly adventurous tooks and members of the Brandybuck sphere, now worked in Bree, selling Shire produce, tobacco, and wine. It was a cheerful, busy day in Hogsmeade when the sky suddenly darkened. A painter working at his easel squinted up and froze as a colossal silhouette blotted out the sun. His brush slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. "Dragon! A dragon!" he cried, paling. Visitors gasped and scattered, terrified by their first sight of a dragon. The locals, however, waved and cheered. "Lord Duir is back," they shouted. They had known Dewey had been away a month, traveling on Smaug's back. Seeing the dragon return meant their lord had come home. Where outsiders saw a terrifying beast, the townsfolk saw their protector and their pride. Smaug let out a triumphant roar in answer and drifted down to land on the castle's great lawn. Edward, the butler, had heard the commotion and hurried out. He bowed deeply, beaming. "My lord, welcome home." Dewey leaped down from the dragon and waved him off. "No need for ceremony, Edward. Anything happen while I was gone?" "Nothing of consequence, my lord," Edward replied. "Mayor Luke and Mayor Lucky have been stopping by with their regular reports, but there's been no trouble." Dewey nodded, satisfied. After Edward left, Smaug nudged him with a hopeful rumble. Dewey headed to the cellar first, estimating the space. "This will need expanding if I'm going to store everything," he muttered. He cast the undetectable extension charm and doubled the cellar's volume without a trace. Then, with Smaug watching like a child on Christmas morning, Dewey tipped half the treasure he had taken from Moria onto the stone floor. Gold coins and jewels cascaded and clanked, forming sparkling hills. Smaug's eyes gleamed. He burrowed into the glittering heap and rolled like a dog in a pile of blankets. Dewey suppressed a laugh. Dragons, or so he suspected, had been made by a creator with a weakness for riches. Morgoth might have been rash in some things, but Dragon's obsession with treasure was legendary. Moria's hoard rivaled the Lonely Mountains. Even a tenth of that treasure was enough to satisfy Smaug for days. When Dewey added the Moria wealth to what he already had, the mound was high enough to bury the dragon entirely. Smaug wasn't done. He craned his neck and sniffed the air. "Master! Mithril! Bring the mithril! I can smell it!" Mithril was worth far more than gold, and Smaug wanted it guarded. Dewey rolled his eyes and muttered, "Are you a dog?" He produced the boxes Balin had given him, mithril ore and artifacts, then set them where the dragon could see them. Smaug's tail swept them almost possessively to his side, and his gaze burned with greedy insistence. Dewey shoved his head away. "Not a chance. I have plans for the rest. You won't get it all." Smaug sulked, then buried his snout in the coins and slept, leaving Dewey to chuckle at the creature's single-mindedness. Bored of arguing, Dewey left him to it and went on to other business. He returned the serpent beast Hailbow from the space box to the Chamber of Secrets. The creature had been badly taxed in the battle with the Balrog, its scales singed and its body scorched, and would need time to recover. The chamber was stocked with plenty of giant spider meat, more than enough to nurse Hailbow back to health. The only other item still in stasis was the massive petrified statue of the Watcher in the water. It had been turned to stone by basilisk venom. Ordinary magic wouldn't restore it. Dewey tucked the statue away in the space box for now, planning to attempt a cure once he had brewed a mandrake-based restorative. From the chamber, he went to the laboratory and pulled out the Balrog's body. The carcass was hideous, blackened, twisted, and exuding a sulfuric stench, but it was also the remains of a Maya. Even a fallen Maya was a thing of enormous study value. Dewey inspected the chest and found small fragments of red crystal scattered where Aglos had struck the Balrog's heart. He collected every shard and sealed them in a crystal vial, core remnants of a demigod-level being, too precious to waste. He intended to experiment, to learn what powers those fragments might hold. With the treasure stowed and his experiments planned, Dewey felt the heady pull of new possibilities. The goblin craft would take time to learn, the mithril would reveal its secrets, and the Balrog's fragments hinted at power and knowledge he had barely begun to imagine. Smaug snored softly from his bed of gold. Outside, Hogsmeade carried on in its peaceful prosperity. Home, for now, was exactly as Dewey had left it, and full of promise. Chapter 177, Fire Creature. Dewey lifted the mithril box that held the fire crystals and cracked the lid. A blast of heat rolled out like a physical thing. The crystals inside burned like living coals, glowing red-hot, turning the interior of the box into a furnace. The air shimmered and warped. Startled by how quickly the room warmed, Dewey snapped the lid shut. If the box hadn't been forged from heat-tempered mithril, any normal metal or stone would have melted long ago. Still, before he closed it for good, he plucked out a small fire crystal, no larger than a baby's fist. Even so, it radiated thousands of degrees. He set it on an iron block. The block blistered and burned through. He placed it on a thick stone slab. The stone cracked and flowed like lava. Last, more as a curiosity than expectation, he pressed it to the corpse of the Balrog. Since its death, the Balrog's body had already cooled into a lava-like stone. Once the magic crystal had been removed, much of its fire essence had seeped away and its flesh had hardened. But where the fire crystal touched, the Balrog's stone slowly softened, not because it was melting, but because some spark of life was being restored. The hardened tissue regained elasticity and warmth. Dewey's eyes lit up. This was far beyond what he'd hoped for. If the fire crystal could restore the Balrog's elemental structure, it would make the corpse far more useful for study. He opened the mithril box again, used his wand to expand its interior space, and shoved the Balrog's body inside. The fire crystals filled the box with blistering heat, enough to liquefy the hardest metals, but the Balrog did not burn. Instead, its entire body flickered as if waking. Flames licked its skin and elemental energy surged. For a tense moment, Dewey feared a true revival, but the Balrog remained inert, merely reactivated in structure and appearance. Delighted, Dewey left the Balrog sealed with the crystals. Elemental beings like Balrogs are condensations of fire and shadow. Their fire aspect dissipates the longer they remain dead until they become nothing but worthless stone. If the fire crystals could preserve and even restore that element, the Balrog's body could be kept useful for research. From a chest wound on the Balrog's torso, a viscous magma-like blood oozed. Dewey bottled it in a mithril vial and dropped a grain-sized fire crystal into the bottle to keep the blood from solidifying back into stone. Divine blood, he thought. What could it do? He set up experiments. First, he tried ordinary subjects, birds, lizards, snakes, even a few orcs, wargs, and trolls, injecting them with Balrog blood. Most were simply incinerated or exploded. The blood's temperature and volatility were lethal to mundane flesh. Then he remembered the Balrog heart fragments he'd kept. He laid out a new procedure: implant a dust-sized shard of Balrog heart into a subject's heart, then introduce a little Balrog blood. He started with a lizard. Nothing happened at first, and Dewey worried the fragment had been too small. Then the lizard's scales flushed red and its cold-blooded body began to burn hot. Dewey injected a drop of Balrog blood. The lizard convulsed violently, shrieked, and went limp. Then suddenly its whole body burst into living flame. Dewey braced for ash, but the lizard leapt straight off the table and dove into a nearby fireplace. Dewey watched, astonished. The flames did not burn it to death. Instead, the lizard changed in the fire, its colors becoming iridescent and its body suffused with a steady, magical burn. It remained in the blaze as if it were comfortable, and magical signatures showed it had become a true magic creature. He pulled the smoldering lizard out with a finger loop of will, and the creature spat a tiny spark at him in warning. Dewey laughed and murmured, "A touch vindictive, aren't you, little one?" But the moment the fire lizard left the flames, its vitality drained away. The fire along its skin guttered, and it grew weak. Outside the blaze, it quickly withered. Dewey returned it to the hearth. It revived instantly. After a few more tests, he confirmed what he feared and hoped. This creature could not survive away from living fire. The longer it was out of flame, the weaker it became until it died. Practical as ever, Dewey conjured a pocket of flame around the lizard whenever he needed to move it, and began cataloging it with his wand. Its offensive power was modest, sparks and small flares anyone could smother, but the fact that he had accidentally made a new type of magic creature thrilled him. He drew a tiny sample of its blood and sealed it, then used the same method to make a second fire lizard so the first would have a companion. The two settled into the fireplace and, after a little courting, began to mate. Dewey watched, faintly bemused, then left them to it. They couldn't leave the hearth anyway, so he didn't worry about them running off or setting the lab ablaze. Feeling encouraged, he moved on to a venomous snake. Under his stare, the reptile coiled defensively and hissed in Parseltongue. But the words betrayed more fear than threat. "Human, don't come closer. I'm dangerous. Don't, please don't." Dewey grinned and answered in the snake's tongue. "You don't have to be ordinary. Your life is short now. Don't you want to be stronger and live longer? Look at those two lizards, powerful. They can live in flames." The snake's simple mind latched onto the promise. It watched him warily as Dewey prepared a larger Balrog heart shard. Before it could fully protest, he'd grafted the fragment into the snake's heart and injected Balrog blood. The snake writhed and cracked, its flesh bubbling with fissures that glowed magma red. It crooned, desperate, "Fire, I need fire," in Parseltongue. Dewey obliged, flooding the corner with flame. The snake drank the fire hungrily, as if parched and finally quenched. Within the blaze, its skin sloughed off and ash-black flakes and fresh ash-white scales formed beneath. Its eyes lit like burning coals. Dewey probed its new status. "What can you do?" he asked. The snake examined itself and answered slowly. "I can make my body detonate, produce great heat to burn enemies to cinders." Dewey blinked. A self-destructing snake wasn't exactly what he'd expected. Then the snake opened its mouth and bit a nearby mouse. The mouse screamed, and its flesh burst into flame from the inside out until only a pile of warm ash remained. Dewey's eyes widened. The venom had changed, deadly in a new, horrifying way. "There's one more thing," the snake said, sounding oddly bashful. "What now?" Dewey prompted, curious. I'm about to lay eggs." Dewey stared. "You were pregnant?" The snake wriggled its body as if embarrassed. "First time. I had an encounter with a handsome mate. Who knew I'd get pregnant?" Dewey stared at his luck. He'd inadvertently selected a pregnant female. Like the fire lizards, this transformed snake, now a fire snake, had a strong dependence on flame. But compared to the lizards, which couldn't survive away from fire for even a minute, the fire snake could leave the flames for about an hour. As contractions came on, the snake slithered to a dark corner away from the hearth and strained. It produced 7 eggs, each red and radiating intense heat. It couldn't lay the eggs in flame. The heat would cause them to explode like bombs, so the mother had to find a cool, dark spot to deposit them, then hurry back into the warmth of the fire within an hour, or she would die. Dewey watched the steaming clutch of eggs, a mixture of awe and calculation stirring in him. The accidental creation of the fire lizard and fire snake had opened an entirely new line of experiments, and perhaps new, dangerous, and valuable discoveries. Chapter 178, Pet Kraken Dewey watched the 7 newly laid snake eggs warily as he moved them to the experiment table. Each egg pulsed with dangerous heat, more like live bombs than anything that should exist in a laboratory. One wrong move, and the room would be a furnace. The mother snake, having finished with her brood, slid back into the heart of the flames without a backward glance, as if her duty were done and she needed to recharge. Dewey felt a surge of helplessness. Fire salamanders could not leave the blaze and posed only a local hazard, but these fire snakes could wander away for hours and drag blazing eggs with them. If he didn't keep them contained, his castle, his work, could easily be reduced to ash. And if any escaped, Hogsmeade and the surrounding forest would be at risk. He couldn't simply kill them now that they existed. He cast a freezing charm on one egg to put it into suspended dormancy. Better to study it later. The remaining 6 eggs spontaneously ignited. Slender, gray-white snakes slithered out of the flames, hungrily drawing in heat and instinctively crawling toward any nearby fire, leaving trails of ash in their wake. 3 went straight to the mother and settled into the blaze, but she displayed none of the expected maternal instinct. She bared her fangs at them, territorial and hostile. If she'd been any less acquainted with them, she might have swallowed her own offspring. The other 3 pushed their way into the salamander's fireplace, driving the 2 salamanders to the fringes, where they cowered, unable to approach. The newborn snakes even turned on each other, fangs bared, competing for a single fire pit. Dewey rubbed his temples. He quickly summoned 6 small flames and assigned one to each hatchling, quelling their fights. Then he prepared a proper containment. He found a room free of flammable materials, expanded it with an undetectable extension charm, and built a dozen small fireplaces into the surrounding walls. He lit them, arranged the mother and 6 hatchlings each their spot, and left the salamanders in their original hearth, less dangerous, and in any case they would die quickly if removed from the fire, so he kept them as an exotic fixture for his fireplaces. He stopped there with the experiment. The fragments of the fiendfire heart had clearly been the primary force turning ordinary lizards and snakes into these magical, heat-born beasts. The fiendfire blood had acted only as a catalyst. Both ingredients were scarce. He couldn't squander them on further animal trials. He needed to reserve them for more important plans. With that settled, Dewey turned to an older problem, the petrified water monitor. Leaving the creature boxed in a spatial container was no solution. He would have to revive and subdue it. For that, he needed a restorative potion. He went to the herbology floor and stepped into the room where the king's grass grew. Warm, moist air greeted him. The chamber was its own little ecosystem. An azure ceiling, lost in clouds, sunlight filtering down, rolling hills, a ribbon of stream that fed a clear lake. Hundreds of king's grass plants filled the floor, their white flowers scenting the air. Dewey had transplanted many into the garden too. With the white trees' presence, they thrived even in Weathertop's poor soil. He'd allowed the villagers to take some for serious cases under Edward the butler's supervision. But today he wasn't here for the king's grass. The lake's edge held water lilies and goldberry, gifts from Tom. The lilies, blessed by Goldberry the river daughter, possessed far more curative power than king's grass. On the far bank, a ring of broad-leaved plants lay half-buried in the soil. At the sight of a stranger, most froze as if to avoid notice. A few, however, uprooted themselves and scuttled away on tiny feet, mandrakes. Dewey raised his hand and summoned the fastest mandrake in mid-run. It twisted, shrieked a high, piercing scream, and flailed in the air. Dewey had already cast a silencing charm, ignoring the noise. He withdrew a syringe and took a measured dose of the mandrake's green sap. He'd studied Snape's notes on restorative potions and, thinking of sustainable methods, chosen to extract sap instead of using the entire root. With what he needed collected, he tossed the protesting mandrake back into the bushes, where it burrowed out of sight. Back in the potion lab, he set to work. A few days later, the restorative potion was finished. Snape's instructions had been precise. The brew turned out perfect on the first try. Dewey bottled several doses, keeping one for the water monitor and storing the rest in the cabinet. The restorative potion could reverse petrification, undo transfigurations, and neutralize curses, so it was prudent to have extra. Carrying a single bottle, Dewey opened the spatial box containing the water monitor. The giant octopus lay like a stone effigy. He poured the potion into its cavernous mouth. Slowly, the petrified gray transformed back into dark green flesh. Stiff tentacles unfurled and flexed. Even the tentacles that had been severed by a Sectum Sempra-type curse began to knit and regrow. The restorative potion purged the lingering effects of dark magic and stimulated regeneration. The beast flung itself awake and lashed out. Its enormous tentacles whipped toward Dewey. Calm, Dewey flicked his wand, and fiendfire exploded into being between them, a wall of controlled inferno that incinerated the nearest lashes to ash. Fiendfire surged and filled the box, turning the space into a blazing realm, but the flames moved around Dewey like a courtly retinue, never burning him. The water monitor shrieked, tormented by the surrounding fire. If he hadn't regulated the blaze, it would have been consumed outright. Even so, the heat seared and salted pain into the creature, as if it were seconds from being burned alive, though miraculously, no visible burning appeared on its skin. Dewey's eyes were cold. He allowed the fiendfire to press the beast toward exhaustion until it gasped as if at its last breath. Then he made his terms. "I know you understand me," he said calmly. "I can overlook your offense, but on one condition: you submit to me. If you refuse, these flames will unmake you. First your tentacles, then your skin, your organs, your bones, and finally your consciousness. Choose now." The fiendfire took on terrible shapes at his command: dragons, basilisks, fiendish wraiths that gnawed with hungry eyes. The water monitor recoiled, tentacles drawn tight, horror in its gaze. Driven by survival, it nodded in frantic assent just as the fire threatened to touch it. Dewey extracted a drop of blue-tinged blood from the octopus with a small needle, then drew a drop of his own. He cast a quick binding spell. The two drops merged into a single bead, red and blue, swirling together, and he sent it down the creature's throat. The bead dissolved into its bloodstream, forging an invisible but absolute link. It was a variant of the blood oath he had once used on the basilisk, a bond that made the creature incapable of harming him and compelled total obedience. The octopus trembled through the procedure, but made no move to resist under the weight of the fiendfire's threat. When the binding was complete, Dewey dismissed the flames. "From this day forward, you are no longer the water monitor," he said. "You are my pet, Kraken." The giant creature bowed. It was a deep, solemn motion, total submission. Dewey watched it lower its head, the name settling between them like law. Chapter 179, Forge. With the great Kraken subdued, it could not be left in the box. Duir carried the container to the Black Lake at the foot of the mountain and released the creature onto the water. The Kraken surged forward like a parched traveler finding an oasis. Water was the source of its power. As soon as it touched the lake, it grew lively, its severed tentacles knitting back on in moments. It swept 24 thick arms through the surface, sending towering waves across the water. The commotion drew the attention of Hogsmeade's residents on the far shore. At first, they were stunned to see such a colossal animal, nearly the size of Smaug himself, emerge from the lake. But an observant villager spotted Duir standing above on the shore. Seeing the Kraken acknowledge him as master, they relaxed. Their lord already kept a dragon, a giant eagle, and a massive serpent. Another great sea beast hardly raised an eyebrow. Duir noticed the stir across the water and called to the Kraken, "Do not attack anyone on the town side. Understand?" The Kraken nodded. It could not speak, but it was intelligent enough to grasp the command and respect Duir's authority. Hoofbeats echoed, and Mayor Luke rode up on a swift horse. The horse kept its distance from the Kraken's aura, so the mayor dismounted and hurried to Duir. He swallowed his fear, bowed, and asked, "Lord Duir, about this creature, will it stay in the lake?" "Yes," Duir replied. "It is a guardian I placed here. It will not harm Hogsmeade under my command." Luke exhaled in relief, but hesitated. "Some of the townsfolk fish the lake extensively. Will that be a problem?" Duir waved the concern away. "Half the lake, the side closer to the castle, will be the Kraken's. The other half is yours. Fish as you like, so long as you keep clear of the castle side." "The Lord is generous," Luke said, smiling, and carried the news back to town. The fishermen adapted quickly. They kept to their half of the lake, and over time, learned to live alongside the Kraken. When one fisherman accidentally capsized and nearly drowned, a Kraken tentacle hauled him to shore, and the two sides finally began to interact. Fishermen brought offerings, especially alcohol, which the Kraken took to, and the creature often herded schools of fish toward their nets. It even swam to the town's shore to bask and accept scraps. Brave children would poke at waving tentacles or hang from them as they floated. Parents, reassured by Duir's decree, let them play. Travelers, merchants, and bards came to marvel from a distance. After settling the Kraken, Duir returned to the castle to begin his next project, building a forge. He had learned the goblin forging techniques and intended to put them to use. Balin had given him several chests of mithril ore, and more was promised from Moria. In this world, mithril, known among goblins as goblin silver, was a rare magical metal essential to many goblin methods. To master those techniques, he would need to smelt and work mithril. Under Smaug's resentful gaze, Duir claimed the unworked ore. He chose the 33rd floor of his tower to be the smithy, but first he went below. Using magic, he carved a tunnel deep into the mountain until he found a vein of iron, small and ignored by the dwarves who had first tunneled here. For Duir's purposes, it was ideal. At the vein's most concentrated point, he placed a fist-sized piece of mother mithril at the core and then set up an eggshell of crystal around it, using flame crystals from his stores. The crystals poured out intense heat and quickly melted the surrounding iron into a river of glowing magma. Duir, protected by a potion of fire resistance, worked unscathed. He felt an invisible radiation from the mother mithril that slowly suffused the metallic magma, transmuting it into mithril. The process was glacial at first, perhaps a gram per year, but the flame crystals purified and amplified the mother mithril's effect. If he had not possessed a goblin's attunement to metal and magic, he might not have noticed the change at all. When he finished, Duir collapsed the tunnel and sealed it. In a few decades, or centuries, a new vein of mithril might bloom here. It was no Moria, but it would be another source, and given the uncertainty of dwarven promises after Balin's death, any reliable supply mattered. Back on the 33rd floor, Duir set about building the goblin-style furnace. Flame crystals burned far hotter than ordinary fuel. They could even melt stone and iron. The only practical material to contain such heat was mithril itself, which could be forged once and then withstand truly extraordinary temperatures. Duir prepared his tools, enlarged a mithril container, and lined the bottom with flame crystals before adding mithril ore. Under the crystal's blistering heat, the ore became a molten silver river. He poured the molten metal into a mold, and once it had cooled slightly, took up a hammer reinforced with a strip of mithril. He struck the inner and outer walls of the forming furnace to a precise rhythm, chanting goblin runes and pushing magic through the blows. Goblin forging held that metal had a memory. Shaping was a kind of conversation between smith and ore. By hammering in specific patterns, laying down spells, and imprinting intent, Duir awakened the metal's memory and bound it to his design. Each strike sent sparks and magic into the furnace, and as he worked, the mithril took on the enchanted pattern he was inscribing. When the shape was right, Duir switched to a mithril graver and cut goblin runes into the inner wall. The work consumed a week of sweltering labor. Even with the potion protecting him, he was drenched in sweat from both heat and exertion. At last, he lowered a hand and spoke, "Aguamenti." A clear jet of spring water burst forth and hissed over the furnace, turning steam into mist that drifted away. The finished forge gleamed silver, pot-bellied and oval, its surface etched with runes. Duir placed several flame crystals inside. Though the lid remained off, their heat was contained. Touching the exterior registered only cool metal. Peering in, Duir saw an interior that seemed to widen beyond its narrow mouth, a roaring, impossibly hot crucible within. He tossed a lump of mithril ore into the maw. It vanished, purged of slag and impurities, becoming the purest mithril magma. He added box after box. Outwardly, it looked as if the furnace should overflow, yet it accepted and melted every load, automatic and inexhaustible. Duir tapped the forge gently with his wand, and it shrank in response, finally settling to a palm-sized object without spilling a drop. He had created a goblin-inspired magic furnace, one whose internal volume expanded to accommodate ore, whose heat output could be amplified to extremes, and whose purification processes burned away impurities completely. It also bore the greatest goblin trick of all. Each metal it smelted left a trace in the furnace, reinforcing and repairing it, so that it grew stronger with use. Standing before the small silver furnace, Duir felt the weight of possibility. With it, he had laid the groundwork to become one of Middle-earth's true smiths.